There is a stillness that lives in certain rooms, a quiet that belongs not to silence itself, but to the spaces where questions have been asked and answers sought with infinite patience. And tonight I find myself standing at the threshold of such a place, a threshold between the seen and the unseen, between what happened and what remains, thinking about forensics, about this strange and careful science of reading what has been left behind. The air here carries a particular weight, not heavy exactly, but dense with attention, with the careful accumulation of details that might otherwise vanish like breath on glass. And I am thinking about the way evidence speaks, how it whispers its truths to those who know how to listen, how the methods of forensic investigation have taught us that a single fiber or a scatter of dust can hold within it an entire story waiting to be read. In the beginning, long before laboratories gleamed with specialized light, before microscopes revealed worlds invisible to the naked eye, there was only observation, the ancient and patient art of seeing what others missed. And I imagine those early moments when someone first understood that a footprint in mud was more than a mark, that it was a record, a fragment of time made solid, a ghost pressed into earth. The history of reading these traces, of learning to speak the language of physical evidence, unfolds like a slow dawn, not sudden, not bright all at once, but gradual, illuminating one small corner at a time, revealing patterns that had always been there, waiting. I think of investigators standing in doorways centuries ago, candlelight flickering against walls, shadows moving like living things, and how they must have sensed that something could be learned from the arrangements of objects, from the position of a body, from stains that marked surfaces like dark constellations. But the tools to read these signs, the methods to translate them into certainty, these had not yet been forged. The crime scene, as we understand it now, as a protected space, a kind of sacred text that must not be disturbed before it can be properly interpreted. This idea emerged slowly through centuries of trial and error, through the gradual understanding that chaos could be read, that violence left signatures, that truth had a physical presence, if only we learned to perceive it. There is something almost archaeological about this work, the careful brushing away of what obscures, the documentation of layers, the recognition that time itself becomes embedded in materials, in the way blood dries, in the settling of dust, in the cooling of a room. And I am drawn to the patience this requires, the willingness to move slowly through a scene, to resist the urge to leap to conclusions, to let the evidence accumulate its testimony grain by grain. In the gaslit streets of the 19th century, in the narrow alleys of ancient cities, in places where law was still finding its shape, there were those who began to understand that investigation could be systematic, that it could be methodical, that what seemed like chaos might yield to careful examination. And this understanding, this shift in perception, marks the beginning of something that would transform the nature of justice itself. I picture rooms preserved as they were found, nothing moved, nothing disturbed, every object catalogued, every surface examined, and the strange intimacy of this, the way investigators must enter into the final moments of another's life, must reconstruct from fragments and traces what transpired in spaces now empty and still. The science of it grew from small observations, from noticing that different substances burned differently, that poisons left particular signs in tissue, that handwriting carried individual character, that no two weapons marked in quite the same way, and each of these realizations, each small discovery, added another tool, another way of reading the silent testimony of things. Before fingerprints were understood as unique, before blood types were known, before DNA revealed its microscopic certainties, there was only what could be seen with careful eyes, what could be measured with simple instruments, what could be reasoned through deduction and the slow assembly of facts. And yet, even with these limitations, patterns emerged, methods developed, a discipline began to take shape. I am thinking now of the way a crime scene exists in multiple dimensions, in the physical space where events occurred, in the photographs that freeze it in time, in the diagrams that map its geometry, in the written reports that translate observation into language, and how each of these representations captures something, preserves something, but none quite holds the complete truth, which exists perhaps only in the vanished moments themselves. In the past that cannot be revisited except through these fragments, these traces, these careful reconstructions. And so tonight, in this quiet contemplation, I find myself at the beginning of a long examination, preparing to move slowly through the history of how we learned to read the aftermath of violence, how we developed methods to make the invisible visible, to give voice to the silent, to find pattern in apparent randomness, and certainty in the midst of confusion. The story begins, as so many stories do, in China, now in the 13th century, where a magistrate named Song Sai compiled what would become the first known forensic text, a manual called The Washing Away of Wrongs. And in this remarkable document, written in the year 1247, there exists the earliest systematic approach to death investigation, the first acknowledgement that the dead could tell their stories if examined with care. Song Shi understood something profound, that a body carried evidence of what had been done to it, that wounds from a blade differed from wounds made by blunt force, that drowning left signs distinct from strangulation, and he documented these differences with meticulous attention, describing how to examine remains, how to distinguish between injuries made before death and those inflicted after, how to read the language written in flesh and bone. His work spoke of examining bodies in natural light, of noting the patterns of lividity, the settling of blood in tissues after the heart had stopped. And he recognized that this settling followed rules, that it could indicate position, could reveal whether a body had been moved, could whisper truths about the final moments of life. And these observations, made centuries before microscopes or chemical tests, represent the birth of forensic pathology, the understanding that death itself was evidence. But this knowledge, this systematic approach, remained largely isolated to the East, and in Europe, in the centuries that followed, investigation remained crude, reliant on confession, on testimony that could be extracted through torture, on circumstantial observation that lacked method or rigor, and justice, such as it was, often depended more on power and persuasion than on evidence. The Renaissance brought new tools, new ways of seeing, and with them came the slow recognition that the natural world operated according to principles that could be discovered, documented, understood, and among those who began to apply this thinking to questions of law and crime was a French surgeon named Ambroise Paré, who in the 16th century began documenting his observations of wounds, of the patterns left by different weapons, of the ways violence marked the body. Paré worked in an age of wars, of duels, of public executions, and he saw countless injuries, studied how metal penetrated skin, how bones fractured under force, how blood flowed from severed vessels, and he wrote about these observations, creating detailed accounts that would serve as reference for those who came after, building a foundation of anatomical knowledge that would prove essential to forensic medicine. In the 1600s, in Italy, a physician named Fortunato Fidelis published works on medical jurisprudence, on the intersection of medicine and law, and he too documented the signs of death, the changes that occurred in bodies over time, the differences between death by natural causes and death by violence, and his writings, like those of Paré, represented small steps toward a more systematic understanding, toward the idea that investigation could be scientific, could be based on observable fact rather than speculation. But perhaps the most significant shift came with the understanding of poisons, substances that killed invisibly, that left no obvious wounds, that could transform murder into something that resembled natural death, and the challenge of detecting these substances, of proving their presence in tissue, would drive some of the earliest developments in forensic chemistry. In the 1700s, physicians and chemists began to develop tests for common poisons, for arsenic in particular, which had long been a favored tool of those who wished to kill quietly, to escape detection, and the ability to identify arsenic in the body, to prove its presence beyond doubt, represented a profound breakthrough, a way of making the invisible visible, of catching what had previously escaped notice. The test developed by James Marsh in 1836 revolutionized poison detection. It was sensitive, reliable, capable of detecting arsenic in tissues even when only minute quantities remained. And for the first time, prosecutors could prove poisoning with scientific certainty, could present juries with chemical evidence rather than mere suspicion. And this ability to demonstrate truth through reproducible testing marked a turning point in forensic science. Around this same time, in France, a professor of chemistry named Mathieu Orfila was establishing toxicology as a rigorous discipline, writing comprehensive texts, developing methods for isolating and identifying poisons, testifying in court cases with the authority of systematic knowledge, and his work demonstrated that forensic science could be taught, could be standardized, could become a profession in its own right. Orfila understood that testimony about poisons had to be unassailable, that the methods had to be precise, that results had to be reproducible, and he emphasized the importance of controls, of eliminating contamination, of documenting every step of analysis, principles that seem obvious now, but were revolutionary in his time, when expertise was often claimed but rarely demonstrated with such rigor. The 19th century brought an acceleration, a proliferation of methods and insights, driven in part by the rise of professional police forces, by the emergence of detectives as a specialized role, by the recognition that solving crimes required more than confession or eyewitness accounts, required evidence that could withstand scrutiny. In France, Eugène François Vidocq, a former criminal turned chief of the first detective bureau, understood the value of documentation, of maintaining records of known criminals, of tracking methods and patterns. And though his techniques were not strictly scientific, his emphasis on systematic investigation, on gathering information and preserving it for future reference, influenced how crimes would be approached for generations. Vidocq recognized that criminals often repeated behaviors, that they had distinctive methods, that understanding these patterns could aid in identification, and he began collecting information about techniques, about the tools thieves preferred, about the ways different types of criminals operated, creating what would eventually evolve into the concept of criminal profiling, the idea that behavior itself could be evidence, but it was in the examination of physical evidence, in the careful analysis of materials left at crime scenes, that forensic science truly began to flourish. And one of the most significant developments came through the work of a French criminologist named Edmond Locard, who in the early 1900s articulated what would become known as Locard's exchange principle, the foundational idea that every contact leaves a trace. Locard understood that when two objects touched, when a person entered a room, when violence occurred, materials were transferred, fibers, hair, dust, soil, and these transfers, though often microscopic, though easily overlooked, represented physical proof of contact, of presence, of interaction, and this principle, this recognition that the physical world recorded every transaction, transformed how investigators approached crime scenes. In his laboratory in Lyon, established in 1910, Locard examined evidence under microscopes, analyzed fibers, compared dust samples, studied the minute traces that others dismissed as insignificant, and he solved cases through these tiny fragments, proving that a suspect had been in a particular place, that clothing had touched certain surfaces, that contact had occurred despite denials. The microscope became an essential tool, revealing worlds invisible to the naked eye, allowing examiners to compare fibers thread by thread, to identify plant materials, to distinguish between different types of dust and debris. And with magnification came precision, came the ability to make distinctions that had previously been impossible. Around the same time, in Austria, a professor named Hans Gross was developing what he called criminal investigation, a systematic approach to examining crime scenes, to collecting evidence, to applying scientific methods to police work, and in 1893 he published Criminal Investigation, a comprehensive manual that covered everything from photography to ballistics, from document examination to the analysis of bloodstains. Gross emphasized the importance of preserving crime scenes, of photographing them before anything was moved, of creating detailed sketches and diagrams, of collecting samples properly, of maintaining chains of custody. And these protocols, these careful procedures, established standards that remain fundamental to forensic investigation today. He understood that evidence could be fragile, that it could be contaminated, that its value depended on how it was handled, and he advocated for specialized training, for investigators who understood the science, who could recognize what was significant and what was not, who could collect materials in ways that preserved their evidential value. The examination of documents also emerged as a forensic discipline in this era. The recognition that handwriting carried individual characteristics, that forged signatures could be detected through careful analysis, that questioned documents could be authenticated or exposed through systematic comparison. Albert Osborne, working in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s, developed methods for comparing handwriting, for analyzing typewritten documents, for detecting alterations and erasures, and he testified in court cases demonstrating that document examination could be rigorous, could be scientific, could provide evidence as reliable as a chemical analysis or fingerprint comparison. The study of firearms identification also began to develop. The understanding that every gun barrel left distinctive marks on bullets, that firing pins created unique impressions on cartridge cases, that these marks could be compared, could link a particular weapon to a particular crime, and this realization that tools left signatures on the materials they contacted opened another avenue for connecting suspects to evidence. In the early 1900s, researchers began using comparison microscopes, instruments that allowed side-by-side examination of bullets, making it possible to see whether the striations matched, whether the marks aligned, and this technology transformed ballistics from educated guessing into precise science, into evidence that could be demonstrated visually, that juries could see and understand. Each of these developments, each new method, each refinement of technique represented a small victory over uncertainty, a way of pushing back against the darkness that obscured truth, and together they formed a growing body of knowledge, a discipline that was becoming increasingly sophisticated, increasingly capable of reading the silent testimony of physical things. And yet, among all these emerging sciences, among all the methods being developed for analyzing materials and comparing specimens, perhaps none would prove as revolutionary, as definitively identifying, as the study of fingerprints. The idea that fingerprints were unique had been observed for centuries in ancient Babylon, in China, where thumbprints were used to seal documents, but the systematic study of fingerprints as a means of identification, the understanding that these patterns were permanent, unchanging throughout life. This knowledge emerged slowly through the work of several researchers in the late 1800s. In India, a British administrator named William Herschel began using fingerprints in the 1850s to prevent fraud, requiring handprints on contracts, noticing that the patterns never changed, that they remained consistent year after year. And though he didn't fully understand the implications, he was documenting something profound, building evidence of permanence and uniqueness. Meanwhile, a Scottish physician named Henry Faulds, working in Japan, began studying fingerprints left on ancient pottery, examining the ridge patterns, and in 1880 he published a letter suggesting that fingerprints might be useful for identifying criminals, that prints left at crime scenes could be compared to those of suspects, and this idea, radical at the time, would transform criminal investigation. Francis Galton, a polymath and statistician, took up the study with scientific rigor, analyzing thousands of fingerprints, calculating the probability that two people might share the same pattern. And in 1892, he published Fingerprints, demonstrating mathematically that the odds of duplication were astronomically small, that fingerprints were effectively unique markers of identity. Galton classified patterns into categories: arches, loops, whorls, creating a system for organizing and comparing prints. And this classification system made it possible to search through collections, to maintain databases, to actually use fingerprints as a practical tool for identification rather than merely a theoretical curiosity. In Argentina, a police official named Juan Vucetich developed his own classification system, and in 1892 he solved the first murder case using fingerprint evidence. A woman had killed her children and injured herself, claiming an unknown assailant had attacked them, but her bloody fingerprint on a doorpost told the truth, revealed her presence, her contact, her guilt. This case demonstrated the power of fingerprint evidence in a way that theory never could. It showed that prints left at scenes could solve crimes, could prove presence beyond denial, could transform investigation from reliance on confession to reliance on physical proof. And slowly, police forces around the world began adopting fingerprint systems. In Britain, Edward Henry refined the classification system, creating a method that allowed efficient searching of large collections, and in 1901, Scotland Yard established a fingerprint bureau, replacing the older Bertillon system of body measurements with this more reliable, more permanent form of identification. The Bertillon system, developed by Alphonse Bertillon in France, had relied on measuring various body parts, head circumference, arm length, foot size, the idea being that the combination of measurements would be unique to each individual, and for a time this anthropometric system was widely used, seemed scientific, seemed certain, but it had flaws. Measurements could vary with position, with the person doing the measuring, with growth or aging, and when two different men at Leavenworth Prison in 1903 were found to have nearly identical Bertillon measurements, but distinctly different fingerprints, the superiority of fingerprinting became undeniable, and the older system was gradually abandoned. Fingerprints could be lifted from surfaces, developed using powders or chemicals, preserved on cards, compared under magnification, and they didn't require the suspect to be present for initial identification. A print left at a scene could be searched against files, could identify someone who had never been questioned, could solve cold cases years after the fact. The development of techniques for revealing latent prints, prints invisible to the naked eye, expanded the reach of this evidence. Investigators learned that oils from skin left impressions on glass, on metal, on paper, and these impressions could be visualized, could be enhanced, could be photographed and preserved. Iodine fuming, one of the earliest methods, involved exposing surfaces to iodine vapor, which would temporarily darken prints, allowing them to be photographed before they faded. And though the results were temporary, the photographs were permanent, creating records that could be studied and compared. Silver nitrate, which reacted with salts in fingerprint residue, provided another method, turning prints dark brown when exposed to light, and this technique worked particularly well on paper, on porous surfaces where other methods failed, expanding the range of materials from which evidence could be recovered. The introduction of fingerprint powder, fine particles that adhered to the oils in prints, made it possible to visualize prints quickly at crime scenes, to photograph them in place, to lift them using tape and preserve them for later comparison. And different powders were developed for different surfaces. Black powder for light surfaces, white or metallic powders for dark ones, fluorescent powders that would glow under ultraviolet light. Each advancement in fingerprint technology represented hours of experimentation, of trying different substances, different application methods, of learning what worked and what didn't, and this patient development of technique, this refinement through practice, characterized much of a forensic science in this era. Blood, another ubiquitous form of evidence, also began to yield its secrets, to tell stories through chemical analysis and microscopic examination, and the development of methods for testing blood, for identifying it as human or animal, for determining type, opened new avenues of investigation. The Kastle-Meyer test, developed in the early 1900s, could detect the presence of blood even in tiny quantities, even in stains that had been washed or diluted. The reagent would turn pink in the presence of hemoglobin, providing a quick presumptive test that could be performed at scenes or in laboratories. But knowing that a stain was blood raised another question. Was it human blood or animal blood? And the development of precipitin tests, using antibodies that reacted specifically with human blood proteins, made it possible to distinguish between species, to confirm that a stain was indeed human, strengthening the evidential value. The discovery of blood types by Karl Landsteiner in 1901 revolutionized both medicine and forensics. The understanding that blood could be classified into groups, A, B, AB, and O, meant that blood evidence could potentially exclude suspects, could narrow possibilities, could provide another layer of identification. If blood at a scene was type A and a suspect had type O, that suspect could be excluded, could be proven not to be the source of that particular stain. And while blood typing couldn't positively identify an individual, it could eliminate possibilities, could focus investigations, could corroborate or contradict other evidence. The analysis of bloodstain patterns also emerged as a discipline. The recognition that blood behaved predictably when it fell, when it was cast off from weapons, when it sprayed from wounds, and that these patterns could reveal information about what had occurred, about position, about movement, about the dynamics of violence. Investigators learned to distinguish between drops that fell straight down, creating round stains, and drops that struck at angles, creating elongated spatters. And by measuring these patterns, by calculating trajectories, they could determine where blood had originated, could locate the position of a victim or attacker at the moment blood was shed. Cast-off patterns, created when blood flew from a moving object like a raised weapon, formed lines of spatters that could indicate the number of blows, the direction of swings, the minimum number of impacts, and these patterns, read correctly, could reconstruct violent events, could tell stories that contradicted claims, that revealed truth hidden in the geometry of blood. The examination of gunshot residue also developed in this era. The understanding that firing a gun created a cloud of particles, burned and unburned powder, metals from the primer and bullet that deposited on the shooter's hands, on nearby surfaces, on victims at close range, and tests for these residues could determine if someone had fired a weapon, could estimate shooting distance, could reconstruct the circumstances of a shooting. The paraffin test, developed in the 1930s, involved coating hands with melted paraffin, allowing it to cool and harden, then peeling it off and testing the inside for nitrates. And while this test had limitations, could produce false positives from fertilizers or fireworks. It represented an attempt to capture invisible evidence to prove contact with firearms through chemical traces. Lighter, more sophisticated tests using atomic absorption spectroscopy could detect specific metals, barium, antimony, lead, the signature elements of gunshot residue. And these tests were more specific, more reliable, better able to distinguish gun residue from other sources of contamination. The development of photography as a forensic tool transformed how evidence was preserved, how crime scenes were documented, how findings could be shared and studied, and the evolution of forensic photography from early daguerreotypes to more practical processes paralleled the growth of scientific investigation. Alphonse Bertillon, beyond his anthropometric system, pioneered systematic crime scene photography, establishing protocols for taking overall views, medium views, and close-ups, for using metric scales to show size, for photographing from consistent angles that would allow later reconstruction and analysis. He understood that photographs created permanent records, that they captured details that might be missed in sketches, that they preserved the scene as it was, allowing investigators to return visually, to study and restudy, to notice things that weren't apparent during the initial examination. The introduction of portable cameras, of flash powder that could illuminate dark scenes, of faster film that could capture detail in available light, all expanded what could be documented, what could be preserved as evidence, and photography became as essential to investigation as fingerprinting or chemical analysis. Comparison photography, placing evidence side by side, tool marks next to suspected tools, tire tracks next to suspect tires, allowed visual demonstration of matches, allowed juries to see similarities that experts described, and this visual evidence, this ability to show rather than merely tell, made scientific testimony more accessible, more persuasive. The examination of tool marks, the understanding that screwdrivers and pry bars and cutting implements left distinctive scratches, impressions that could be compared microscopically, added another category of evidence, another way of linking suspects to crimes through the tools they used. Examiners learned to make test marks, to use suspect tools on similar materials under similar conditions, then to compare these known marks to question marks from scenes, looking for correspondence in striations, in the pattern of scratches, in the unique imperfections that characterized each tool. This work required patience, required careful preparation of specimens, required skill with microscopes and photography, but it could place a specific tool at a specific scene, could connect a pry bar found in a suspect's possession to marks on a forced door, could transform a piece of metal into testimony. The middle decades of the 20th century brought an acceleration of forensic capabilities. Technologies developed for war found peaceful applications in laboratories, and the science of reading crime scenes grew more sophisticated, more nuanced, more capable of extracting meaning from ever smaller traces. Spectrography, the analysis of light absorbed or emitted by substance, allowed identification of elements and compounds with precision that chemical tests alone couldn't achieve. And this technology, refined in industrial and academic laboratories, found its way into forensic work, allowing examiners to identify glass fragments, to compare paint chips, to analyze metals and minerals with unprecedented accuracy. The emission spectrograph could determine the elemental composition of tiny samples, could distinguish between materials that looked identical to the naked eye, and this capability meant that fragments of glass from a broken headlight could be matched to a specific manufacturer, that paint chips could be traced to particular automotive lines. That trace evidence became increasingly specific, increasingly individualizing. Neutron activation analysis, developed in the 1950s and 60s, took this even further, bombarding samples with neutrons in nuclear reactors, measuring the radiation emitted, and from these measurements deriving extraordinarily precise elemental profiles. And this technique was so sensitive it could detect trace elements in parts per billion, could analyze samples weighing mere micrograms. For a time, neutron activation analysis was applied to gunshot residue, to arsenic in hair samples, to trace elements in nearly any material, though its expense and the need for nuclear facilities limited its widespread use. It demonstrated what was becoming possible, how deeply investigators could now peer into the composition of things. The comparison microscope, refined and perfected, became standard equipment in forensic laboratories, allowing side-by-side examination of bullets, of fibers, of hair, of any evidence where subtle similarities or differences mattered, and examiners became skilled at identifying class characteristics, features shared by groups of items, and individual characteristics, the unique marks that distinguished one specific item from all others. A bullet might show rifling marks that indicated the caliber and manufacturer of the gun. These were class characteristics shared by thousands of weapons, but the microscopic striations, the tiny imperfections in the barrel that left unique scratches, these were individual characteristics, and matching these could link a bullet to one specific gun to the exclusion of all others. The same principle applied to fibers, to hair, to tire tracks, to any evidence where both general similarities and specific uniqueness existed, and the skill of the examiner lay in distinguishing between what was merely consistent and what was truly individualizing, between what narrowed possibilities and what established certainty. Hair comparison became a common form of microscopic evidence. Examiners learned to identify species, to distinguish human from animal hair, and within human hair to note characteristics like color, diameter, medulla pattern, the distribution of pigment, the condition of the root, and from these observations to assess whether a questioned hair could have come from a particular individual. But hair comparison had limitations. It couldn't provide the kind of absolute identification that fingerprints offered. It could only establish similarity, consistency, and this distinction between association and identification, between could have come from and did come from, would become increasingly important as forensic science matured and faced scrutiny in courts. Fiber evidence, too, relied on comparison, on matching color, diameter, cross-sectional shape, chemical composition, and while fibers could often be traced to specific types of fabric, to particular manufacturers, truly individualizing a fiber to one specific garment remained difficult unless the fiber showed unusual characteristics or damage. The development of gas chromatography in the 1950s revolutionized the analysis of volatile substances, accelerants in arson cases, drugs, explosives, any material that could be vaporized and separated into components. And this technique allowed investigators to identify not just the presence of gasoline or kerosene, but to characterize the specific product, to sometimes even trace it to brands or sources. Arson investigation, once based largely on observation and experience, on recognizing burn patterns and pour patterns, began to incorporate scientific analysis and the collection of debris from fire scenes, the extraction and identification of accelerants, transformed what had been an art into something approaching science. The recognition that fires burned upward, that certain patterns indicated the use of flammable liquids, that multiple points of origin suggested intentional setting. These observations remained important, but they were now supplemented by laboratory analysis, by chemical confirmation of what visual examination suggested. Mass spectrometry, coupled with gas chromatography, provided even greater specificity, allowing not just detection, but precise identification of compounds, and these instruments became essential tools in toxicology laboratories, in drug analysis, in any case where chemical identification mattered. Toxicology itself grew more sophisticated, capable of detecting drugs and poisons at lower and lower concentrations, of identifying metabolites, breakdown products that indicated what substances had been in the body even after the parent compounds had been eliminated, and this capability meant that poisoning could be detected days or even weeks after exposure, that delayed deaths could still be investigated, still be proven. The 1970s and 80s brought computerization, databases that could store and search vast amounts of information, and this technological shift transformed several areas of forensic work, made possible comparisons that would have been impractical when everything existed only on paper. The automated fingerprint identification system, known as AFIS, allowed electronic storage and searching of fingerprint records, and instead of manually comparing a latent print to thousands of cards, an examiner could scan the print, let the computer search the database, and receive a list of candidates, possible matches that could then be verified by human comparison. This didn't replace the examiner's judgment. The final determination of a match still required expert analysis, but it made searching feasible on a scale that had never been possible, allowed prints from old unsolved cases to be compared against newly arrested individuals, allowed connections across jurisdictions, across decades. Similar databases emerged for ballistics. The National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, NIBIN, which stored digital images of bullets and cartridge cases, allowing searches for matches, for connections between crimes, for patterns that might indicate the same weapon being used in multiple incidents. DNA analysis, emerging in the 1980s, would prove to be perhaps the most revolutionary development in the entire history of forensic science, a method that could provide identification with a degree of certainty that approached the absolute, that could work with tiny samples, with degraded evidence, with material decades old. The technique developed by Alec Jeffreys in Britain in 1984, initially called DNA fingerprinting, relied on analyzing regions of DNA that varied greatly between individuals, and by examining multiple regions, by building a profile, investigators could calculate the probability that two samples came from the same person, and those probabilities were often 1 in billions or trillions. The first criminal case using DNA evidence in Britain in 1987 demonstrated the power of this new tool. A man was convicted of murder based on DNA matching, and another man, who had confessed under pressure, was exonerated when DNA proved he couldn't have been the source of the evidence. And this dual capability to convict and to exonerate made DNA evidence particularly powerful. Early DNA analysis required relatively large samples, fresh blood or semen, and the process took weeks, required radioactive materials, produced results on X-ray film that had to be carefully measured and interpreted. But it worked. It provided answers that no other technique could. And laboratories around the world began adopting it, began training analysts, began building databases. The polymerase chain reaction, PCR, developed in the 1980s, allowed amplification of tiny amounts of DNA, making it possible to analyze samples that would have been too small for earlier methods. A few cells, a spot of blood the size of a pinhead, saliva on a stamp or cigarette butt, and this sensitivity opened new possibilities, made DNA analysis practical for a much wider range of evidence. Short tandem repeat analysis, STR, became the standard method by the 1990s, examining specific locations in DNA where short sequences repeated variable numbers of times. And by looking at 13 or more of these locations, analysts could create profiles that were effectively unique, that could identify individuals with extraordinary certainty. DNA databases began to grow. Convicted offenders required to provide samples. Those samples analyzed and profiles stored, and these databases, like fingerprint databases before them, allowed searching, allowed cold hits, allowed investigators to identify suspects who had never been questioned, to solve cases that had been cold for years or decades. The power of DNA to exonerate, to prove innocence, became increasingly apparent as old cases were re-examined, as evidence preserved from decades earlier was finally analyzed with techniques that hadn't existed at the time of trial, and wrongful convictions were overturned. People released from prison after years of incarceration, proven innocent by evidence that had been there all along, waiting for technology to catch up. This exculpatory power, this ability to prove innocence, raised questions about other forms of forensic evidence, about methods that had seemed scientific but perhaps weren't as rigorous as they appeared, and the field began to face scrutiny, began to examine its own foundations, began to ask harder questions about certainty and error rates and the scientific basis of various techniques, bite mark analysis, handwriting comparison, microscopic hair analysis, methods that had been used for decades, that had seemed reliable, began to face challenges, questions about whether they were truly scientific, whether examiners could really make the identifications they claimed, whether error rates were known or even measurable. The National Academy of Sciences report in 2009 examined the state of forensic science, and its findings were sobering. Many forensic disciplines lacked rigorous scientific foundation, had never been properly validated, relied too heavily on subjective judgment, and this report, this critical examination, prompted reflection, reform, a movement toward greater scientific rigor, toward understanding limitations, toward honest assessment of what could and couldn't be claimed with certainty. The field began to change, to require more training, more standardization, more research into error rates and reliability, and accreditation of laboratories became more common, quality control more stringent, the recognition that forensic evidence influenced liberty and life demanded the highest standards, demanded proof of validity, demanded humility about limitations. Digital evidence emerged as a new frontier, computers and phones holding records of communication, of location, of searches and activities, and forensic examiners learned to recover deleted files, to analyze metadata, to trace digital footprints through networks and devices, and this evidence, pervasive, difficult to completely erase, became increasingly central to investigations. The examination of digital media required new skills, new tools, new understanding of how data was stored and could be recovered, and specialists emerged, forensic computer analysts who could navigate file systems, could bypass encryption, could recover evidence from damaged or deliberately wiped drives. Through all these development, through all these technological advances, the fundamental principles remained. Locard's exchange principle, the understanding that contact leaves traces, that evidence exists, that careful examination can reveal truth, and the crime scene itself remained the starting point, the place where evidence waited to be recognized, collected, preserved, analyzed. The protocols for processing scenes grew more elaborate, more careful. Recognition that DNA could be transferred innocently, that contamination could mislead, that proper collection and documentation mattered enormously, and crime scene investigators became more specialized, more trained, more aware of the delicate nature of evidence, of how easily it could be lost or corrupted. And so the history of forensic science reveals itself as a long accumulation, a patient building of knowledge and technique, each generation adding tools, refining methods, learning from errors, and through this accretion, this slow construction of capability, the field transformed from simple observation to sophisticated science, from art to methodology, from intuition to measurement, the deepening understanding of evidence, of what it means and how it speaks, carries us beyond mere technique, beyond the mechanics of testing and comparison into something more profound, the recognition that every crime scene is a kind of text, a document written in materials rather than words, and that reading this text requires not just scientific knowledge, but a particular kind of attention, a willingness to see connections, to notice what is present and what is absent, to understand that silence itself can be evidence. There is a philosophy embedded in forensic work, a set of assumptions about truth and certainty, about what can be known and how we come to know it. And these assumptions have evolved alongside the methods, shaped by successes and failures, by cases solved and cases that remained mysteries, by the humbling recognition that even the best science has limitations, that probability is not certainty, that evidence can mislead as well as illuminate, the principle of individuality, the idea that no two things are exactly alike, underlies much of forensic science. Fingerprints are unique. DNA profiles are unique. Tool marks are unique. And yet this uniqueness exists in a world where measurement is imperfect, where samples are incomplete, where degradation and contamination introduce uncertainty. And so the absolutes we seek are always approached through probabilities, through statistical arguments that express confidence but never quite reach certainty. This tension between the desire for definitive answers and the reality of probabilistic conclusions runs through the entire history of the field, and it raises questions about how we communicate findings, how we testify in court, how we help juries understand what evidence does and doesn't prove, and the evolution toward more honest, more nuanced expression of certainty represents a maturation, a growing scientific humility, the phenomenon of transfer. Locard's insight that contact leaves traces operates in both directions, and this bidirectionality means that evidence can be complex, that a suspect who touched a victim will carry traces of the victim, but the victim may also carry traces of the suspect, and disentangling what happened from the physical remnants requires careful thought, consideration of multiple scenarios, awareness that the same evidence might support different interpretations. Context matters enormously. A fiber from a carpet might mean someone was in a room, or it might mean they brushed against someone who had been in that room, or it might have transferred through some other chain of contact, and without additional evidence, without corroboration, that fiber is ambiguous, suggestive but not conclusive, and this recognition that evidence rarely stands alone, that it must be woven together, interpreted in light of other findings, represents sophisticated understanding. The temporal dimension of evidence, the way materials change over time, adds another layer of complexity. Blood dries and darkens. DNA degrades. Fingerprints can be overlaid by other prints. And reading these temporal markers, estimating when something occurred, requires understanding of rates and processes, of how temperature and humidity and other factors influence degradation and change. Time of death estimation, once based on simple observations of rigor mortis and body temperature, has grown more sophisticated but also more cautious. Recognition that individual variation is enormous, that environmental factors complicate every calculation, that precise timing is often impossible, and the shift from claiming to know time of death within narrow windows to acknowledging broad ranges. This too reflects maturation, honest assessment of limits. There is something almost archaeological about the layering of evidence at scenes, the way one event overlays another, the way materials accumulate in strata that can sometimes be read chronologically. Dust over blood suggests the blood was there first. Footprints through blood suggest the prints came after. And these layering relationships, these stratigraphic clues, can help reconstruct sequence, can reveal the order of events even when absolute timing remains uncertain. The question of absence, of what is not present, can be as significant as what is found. The lack of forced entry, the absence of defensive wounds, the missing fingerprints where fingerprints should be. And interpreting these absences requires understanding of what is normal, what is expected, what the presence or absence of particular evidence suggests about what occurred. Clean crime scenes, scenes where evidence has been removed or destroyed, tell their own stories. The act of cleaning is itself evidence, evidence of consciousness of guilt, of an attempt to conceal, and sometimes the cleaning is incomplete. Sometimes it creates new evidence, disturbed dust patterns, chemical residues from cleaning agents, signs that things have been moved or altered, the human element in forensic work, the judgment and interpretation that remains essential even with the most sophisticated technology. means that error is possible, that bias can influence, that expectations can shape perception, and the field has had to confront this to develop protocols that minimize subjectivity, that separate examination from interpretation, that implement blind testing where possible, cognitive bias, the tendency to see what we expect to see, to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm our assumptions, has been recognized as a real concern, and laboratories have implemented measures to address it, linear sequential unmasking, where examiners are given only the information they need at each stage, where they form initial opinions before being exposed to contextual information that might influence their judgment, the adversarial nature of the legal system, where forensic experts may be called by prosecution or defense, where findings are challenged and scrutinized, has helped sharpen the science, has forced articulation of certainty, has demanded that methods be validated, that error rates be studied, that claims be supportable, and this adversarial testing, uncomfortable as it sometimes is for practitioners, serves an important function, separating what is solid from what is speculative. The stories that forensic evidence tells are not always complete, are sometimes fragmentary, ambiguous, open to interpretation, and the skill of the investigator lies not in forcing evidence to tell a particular story, but in remaining open to multiple possibilities, in following where the evidence leads, in being willing to revise conclusions when new findings emerge. Cold cases, cases revisited after years or decades, demonstrate both the persistence of evidence and the value of new techniques. DNA analysis has solved murders from the 1960s and 70s, has identified victims who remained nameless for generations, has connected series of crimes that were never linked when they occurred, and this retrospective power, this ability to reach back through time, represents a kind of justice delayed but not denied. The emotional weight of forensic work, of dealing constantly with violence and death, of entering into the final moments of lives, deserves acknowledgement. This is not abstract science, not detached analysis of neutral materials, but work that brings investigators face to face with human suffering, with cruelty and loss, and the toll this takes. The way it shapes those who do this work is part of the story that often goes untold, and yet there is also satisfaction, the resolution that comes from solving puzzles, from bringing clarity to confusion, from helping survivors understand what happened, from contributing to justice, and these rewards, these moments when truth emerges from careful work, sustain practitioners through the difficulty, through the darkness they regularly encounter. The future promises continued evolution, new technologies, new methods, but the fundamentals will remain. The careful observation, the systematic collection, the patient analysis, the honest interpretation, and these principles, these commitments to rigor and truth, transcend any particular technique, represent the enduring foundation of forensic science. And so, as this examination draws toward its close, as the long history of methods and techniques, of discoveries and refinements begins to settle into reflection, I find myself thinking about the nature of evidence itself, about what it means that the physical world records events, preserves them, holds them in materials that can be read by those with knowledge and patience. There is something almost mystical in this. the idea that truth persists in fibers and fingerprints, in the pattern of blood, in the microscopic traces that survive violence and time, as if the universe itself insists on remembering, on maintaining a record that cannot be entirely erased. And our growing ability to read this record, to extract meaning from smaller and smaller traces, represents a kind of conversation with the physical world, a learning to hear what it whispers. The crime scene, that bounded space where something occurred, exists in multiple states simultaneously. It is a physical location, a collection of materials, a legal concept, a psychological space, and moving through such spaces, seeing them not just as rooms or landscapes, but as texts waiting to be interpreted, requires a particular sensibility, a capacity to hold multiple perspectives, to see the ordinary as potentially significant, to recognize that everything might matter or nothing might matter until the analysis is complete. The practitioners of forensic science, the examiners and analysts and investigators, carry knowledge that transforms perception. They see fingerprints where others see only smudges, see blood-stain patterns where others see only stains, see tool marks where others see only scratches. And this trained perception, this ability to recognize what is significant, represents years of study, of practice, of learning to see. But knowledge brings responsibility, the weight of knowing that conclusions might determine guilt or innocence, might free the wrongly accused or convict the guilty. And this responsibility demands not just technical skill, but ethical commitment to honesty about limitations, to thoroughness in examination, to clarity in communication, to willingness to admit uncertainty when certainty is not possible. The long arc of forensic history, from Songxi's manual in 13th century China to modern DNA databases, represents humanity's persistent effort to distinguish truth from falsehood, to move beyond mere accusation toward proof, to ground justice in evidence rather than in power or persuasion. And this effort, imperfect though it remains, reflects something fundamental about the human desire for fairness, for truth, for resolution. Cases solved decades after they occurred, victims finally identified and returned to families, wrongful convictions overturned. These outcomes demonstrate that the work continues, that old evidence can yield new answers, that persistence and advancing technology can illuminate what once remained dark. And there is hope in this, hope that truth, however long delayed, can still emerge. The tools have changed, have grown more powerful, more sensitive, more capable, but the fundamental questions remain the same. What happened? Who was involved? How did it occur? And these questions, asked at crime scenes for centuries, asked in different languages with different technologies, connect the modern examiner to that long lineage, to everyone who ever stood in the aftermath of violence and sought to understand, to reconstruct, to reveal, and perhaps what endures most, beyond any particular technique, beyond any specific technology, is the commitment to careful observation, to systematic method, to the belief that evidence exists, that it can be found, that it will speak if we learn to listen, and this belief, this faith in the possibility of knowing, underlies everything, motivates the painstaking work, the attention to detail, the refusal to accept easy answers or superficial explanations, the silence of a crime scene, that particular quiet that exists in spaces where violence has occurred carries within it all the stories we might extract, all the evidence we might gather, all the truths we might eventually understand, and standing in that silence, beginning the slow work of documentation and collection represents a kind of promise, a commitment to let the evidence speak, to follow where it leads, to seek truth with patience and precision. And so the story comes full circle, back to that stillness, that quiet, that threshold between knowing and not knowing. And we understand now that this threshold is not a wall, but a passage. That careful work can carry us through it, can transform mystery into understanding, can bring light to darkness, can make the invisible visible, can give voice to the silent. The methods will continue to evolve, new techniques will emerge, new technologies will extend our capabilities, but the essential work remains constant. The patient reading of evidence, the careful reconstruction of events, the commitment to truth, and these commitments, these principles will endure, will guide the field forward, will continue to serve justice, to honor victims, to seek clarity in the aftermath of chaos. And now, at the end of this long examination, the story settles, grows quiet, fades into reflection, into the understanding that forensic science is ultimately about remembering, about refusing to let violence erase truth, about maintaining the record that the physical world creates, and reading it with care, with skill, with dedication to accuracy and justice. The evidence waits. In archives and databases, in cold case files and evidence rooms, patient, persistent, ready to speak when the right questions are asked, when the right techniques are applied, when attention is finally paid, and this waiting evidence, this preserved potential for truth, represents hope, represents possibility, represents the ongoing conversation between past and present, between what was hidden and what might yet be revealed. And with this, the narrative comes to rest, settles into stillness, into the quiet understanding that some stories unfold slowly, that truth sometimes takes time, that patience is rewarded, that evidence endures, and that the work continues, always continues, in the laboratories and crime scenes, in the careful hands of those who have learned to read what the physical world writes, who have dedicated themselves to this peculiar science, this patient art, this essential service to truth and justice and memory. I imagine a place beyond the edges of waking thought, a realm where the borders between earth and sky dissolve into something older, something that breathes with the rhythm of countless ages. There is a quality to certain stories that makes them feel less like tales and more like returning, as if the mind already knows these shapes, these names, these faces that peer through the mist of time with eyes both human and infinite. Tonight, the journey leads toward the peaks of mountains that touch the ceiling of the world, toward rivers that have flowed since before memory began to keep its records, toward a tradition so vast and layered that it seems to contain multitudes within multitudes, like nesting dolls carved from starlight and devotion. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not simple. They are not singular. They are oceans of meaning, forests of symbolism, skies filled with stories that overlap and interweave until the boundary between one tale and another becomes as permeable as morning fog. Imagine standing at the edge of a great river at dawn, the Ganges perhaps, or the Yamuna, waters that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that have carried the prayers of billions, that flow with a patience that makes a human urgency seem like the flutter of a moth's wing. The mist rises from the surface, and in that mist, shapes begin to form, not quite solid, not quite dream. They are presences with forms that shift according to the needs of those who seek them, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always vast beyond the capacity of any single story to contain. This is not a tradition that asks for simplicity. It does not reduce the complexity of existence into neat categories or singular truths. Instead, it sprawls, it proliferates, it embraces paradox with the ease of a river accepting tributaries, each one adding to the whole without diminishing what came before. There are gods here who create and destroy in the same breath, goddesses who nurture and wage war with equal devotion, divine children who play games that determine the fate of worlds, and sages whose thoughts become the architecture of reality itself. To speak of these beings is to enter a landscape where time moves differently, where a single lifetime might span aeons, where a moment of meditation might contain the birth and death of universes, where the playful and the profound dance together without contradiction. The oldest texts speak in a language that feels like it was designed to be chanted, to be sung, to vibrate in the chest and the skull until meaning arrives not through logic alone, but through resonance, through the body's understanding of rhythm and repetition. These are the Vedas, composed in Sanskrit, a tongue so precise that each syllable carries weight, carries power, carries layers of meaning that unfold like lotus petals in slow motion. And from these ancient hymns, these ritual formulas, these cosmic speculations, emerge the figures who will populate a tradition so rich that even after thousands of years, new interpretations continue to blossom like flowers in an endless spring. There is Brahma, the creator, often depicted with four faces looking in all directions, seeing all of time and space simultaneously, holding the Vedas themselves in his hands, embodying the principle of emergence, of manifestation, of the unfolding of potential into form. There is Vishnu, the preserver, who reclines on the cosmic serpent between cycles of creation, who descends into the world in avatar after avatar, taking form as fish, as tortoise, as boar, as half-lion, as dwarf, as warrior prince, as cowherd god, each incarnation a response to a specific crisis, a specific need, a specific imbalance that requires divine intervention. And there is Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the ascetic meditating on Mount Kailash, the wild dancer whose movements create and dissolve reality, the Lord of contradictions who is both the ultimate renunciate and the devoted husband, both the terrible and the auspicious, holding in his being the necessary truth that destruction and creation are not opposites, but partners in the cosmic dance. These three form what later tradition will call the Trimurti, the triple form, the three aspects of the one divine principle, though even this framework is only one way of understanding, one lens among many through which to glimpse the infinite, because alongside these great gods are their consorts, their feminine counterparts who are not subordinate but essential, not secondary but foundational. Saraswati with her Veena, goddess of learning and music and the flowing of knowledge, Lakshmi with her lotuses, goddess of prosperity and grace and the abundance that nourishes life, Parvati in her many forms, from gentle mountain daughter to fierce warrior goddess, embodying Shakti, the divine feminine power that animates all existence. The landscape of this tradition includes countless other beings. Ganesha with his elephant head, remover of obstacles, lord of beginnings, patron of arts and sciences, Hanuman the monkey god, whose devotion knows no limits, whose strength serves righteousness, whose leap across the ocean becomes a symbol of faith transcending impossible distances. There are the planetary deities, the river goddesses, the sacred mountains personified, the principles of dawn and night given faces and names, the very elements themselves worshipped as divine presences, until the entire cosmos becomes populated with consciousness, with intention, with personality. This is a worldview that sees divinity not as distant or abstract, but as intimately woven into the fabric of existence, present in the stone of the temple and the water of the well, in the cow that gives milk and the tree that offers shade, in the guru who teaches and the parent who nurtures, in the beggar on the street who might be a god in disguise, testing the devotion and generosity of mortals. The stories told about these beings are not simple moral fables. They are complex narratives filled with surprising turns, with ethical ambiguities, with moments of profound beauty and shocking violence, with love that transcends death and jealousy that sparks cosmic wars. And as the mist continues to rise from that river at dawn, as the shapes within it become clearer and then dissolve again into formlessness, the invitation is simply to witness, to allow these stories and these beings to unfold at their own pace, to trust that understanding will come not through forcing or grasping, but through patient attention, through the slow accumulation of images and ideas that will gradually form their own constellation of meaning. The journey has just begun, and there are depths yet to explore. The roots reach back further than almost any other living tradition, back into a time when history and mythology had not yet separated into distinct categories, when the line between what was remembered and what was imagined remained beautifully blurred. In the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, in a time scholars now place somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, perhaps much earlier, groups of people were composing hymns, creating rituals, asking questions about the nature of existence with a sophistication that still startles those who encounter these texts for the first time. These were the Vedic people, and their world was one of fire altars and soma offerings, of priests who memorized thousands of verses with such precision that the oral tradition preserved exact syllables across countless generations, creating a living library carried in human memory. The oldest layer, the Rig Veda, contains 10 mandalas, 10 circles of hymns, and within these circles are prayers addressed to forces of nature that are already being personified, already being understood as conscious beings with preferences and personalities. There is Agni, the fire god, present in every hearth and every ritual flame, the messenger between human and divine realms, the witness to every sacrifice, the mouth of the gods that consumes offerings and transforms them into sacred smoke, rising toward heaven. There is Indra, the storm god, the warrior deity who drinks soma and grows mighty, who wields the thunderbolt, who battles the serpent demon Vritra to release the waters, to bring rain, to make the world fertile and habitable. his exploits recounted in hymn after hymn with a vigor and celebration that makes the ancient poetry pulse with energy. There is Varuna, keeper of cosmic order, guardian of Rita, the principle of natural law and moral truth, he who knows all secrets, who sees through darkness, whose 1,000 eyes observe every action, every thought, every deviation from the path of righteousness. And there is Surya, the sun, and Ushas, the dawn, and Vayu, the wind, and the Ashvins, the divine horsemen who race across the sky, each deity embodying some aspect of the natural world while also transcending it, possessing stories and relationships that make them more than mere personifications. But even in these earliest texts, there are hints of something more, questions that probe beneath the surface of polytheistic worship, hymns that ask where these gods came from, whether they too had an origin, whether there might be something prior even to them. The Nasadya Sukta, the hymn of creation, poses questions rather than providing answers. It describes a time before being and non-being existed, before death or immortality, before day or night, a primordial state of potential from which everything emerged. And it ends by wondering whether even the highest gods know the secret of creation, or whether that knowledge belongs to something beyond naming. This philosophical questioning would only deepen over time. But in the Vedic period, the focus remained largely on ritual, on the proper performance of sacrifices, on maintaining the relationship between human and divine through offerings, through praise, through the careful pronunciation of sacred syllables. The priests who performed these rituals were the Brahmins, a class of specialists who devoted their lives to mastering the complex procedures, the exact intonations, the precise gestures required to make the sacrifices efficacious. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the intermediaries between worlds. And the rituals themselves could be elaborate affairs, lasting for days, sometimes for years, involving multiple priests, hundreds of verses, offerings of grain and ghee and animals, the construction of temporary fire, altars with geometrically precise dimensions, the whole enterprise designed to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the prosperity of kings, to secure blessings for the community. Within this ritual framework, the gods were present as honored guests, as powerful allies, as beings who could be pleased or offended, who had their favorite offerings and their preferred modes of address, who might grant sons or wealth or victory in battle if properly propitiated. But the Vedic corpus is vast, and it evolved over centuries, and gradually the focus began to shift from external ritual to internal understanding, from the mechanics of sacrifice to the meaning behind the symbols. The later portions of the Vedas, the Brahmanas, contained detailed explanations of ritual procedures, but they also included stories, mythological narratives that explained why certain practices existed, that connected ritual actions to cosmic events, that made the sacrifice itself a reenactment of creation. And then came the Aranyakas, the forest texts, composed by those who had withdrawn from village life, who meditated in wilderness places, who sought understanding through contemplation rather than through elaborate ceremony, and finally the Upanishads, perhaps the most revolutionary texts in the entire tradition, dialogues between teachers and students, between sages and kings, between seekers and those who had found, conversations that turned the attention inward. that ask not about the gods out there, but about the divine principle within. The Upanishads introduced concepts that would transform the entire tradition, the idea of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, infinite, eternal, beyond all qualities, yet the source of all qualities, not a god among gods, but the reality that underlies gods and humans and all of existence, and the idea of Atman, the inner self, the consciousness that witnesses all experience, that persists through all changes, that is, in the most radical formulation, identical with Brahman, the famous equation tattvam asi, that thou art, collapsing the distinction between the individual soul and the cosmic absolute. These were not ideas that replaced the gods, rather they recontextualized them. The deities of the Vedic pantheon remained important, remained objects of worship and devotion, but they were now understood as manifestations, as particular expressions of the one ultimate reality, as faces that the formless shows to those who need form. This philosophical development occurred gradually, over centuries, in different regions with different emphases. There was no single moment of revelation, no founder declaring a new doctrine. Instead, there was an organic evolution, a slow maturation of ideas through countless conversations, countless meditations, countless moments of insight accumulated and refined. And during this same long period, the society itself was developing the structures that would characterize it for millennia. The Varna system, the division into Brahmins, who performed rituals, Kshatriyas, who governed and fought, Vaishyas, who engaged in commerce and agriculture, and Shudras, who provided service, each group with its own duties, its own dharma, its own role in maintaining the cosmic and social order. The concept of dharma itself became central, this word that means law, duty, righteousness, cosmic order, the way things should be. It was dharma that held everything together, that gave each being its proper place, its proper function, and the gods were understood as guardians and exemplars of dharma, as beings whose actions demonstrated what it meant to live in accordance with cosmic law. But dharma was not simple, not uniform. It varied according to one's station in life, one's age, one's circumstances. What was dharma for a warrior might be adharma for a priest. What was appropriate in youth might be forbidden in old age. The tradition embraced this complexity, this contextual ethics that refused to reduce moral life to simple commandments. Alongside dharma came the ideas of karma and samsara, the understanding that actions have consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime, that the soul transmigrates from body to body, experiencing the fruits of past deeds, creating through each action the conditions for future existence. This was not originally a Vedic concept. It appeared in the Upanishads without clear precedent, and it fundamentally altered the religious landscape, because now the question was not just how to please the gods or perform correct rituals, but how to escape the cycle altogether, how to achieve moksha, liberation, release from the wheel of birth and death. Different paths emerged, different methods proposed for achieving this liberation. The path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, through direct realization of one's identity with Brahman. The path of meditation and withdrawal, leading to the development of what would become yoga in its classical forms. And the path of action, Karma Yoga, performing one's duty without attachment to results. And woven through all of this, The gods continued to evolve, to accumulate new attributes, new stories, new forms of worship. Indra, the great warrior of the Vedas, began to fade somewhat in importance, while other deities grew in stature and complexity. Rudra, a fierce deity mentioned in the Vedas, associated with storms and healing, with the wilderness and the terrifying aspects of nature, gradually transformed into Shiva, acquiring attributes and myths that made him one of the great gods of the tradition. No longer just a dangerous force to be appeased, but a complex figure embodying contradiction, the ascetic and the householder, the destroyer and the transformer, the lord of yoga and the cosmic dancer. And Vishnu, who in the Vedas was a relatively minor solar deity, known mainly for taking 3 steps to measure the universe, began to grow in significance, to accumulate a mythology of preservation and intervention, of descending into the world to restore balance whenever dharma declined. The idea of the avatar, the descent, the divine incarnation, became particularly associated with Vishnu, and stories began to be told of his various forms. The fish who saved Manu from the flood, the tortoise who supported the mountain used to churn the cosmic ocean, the boar who rescued the earth from the depths, each myth addressing some crisis, some threat to the cosmic order that required divine response. These were not yet the fully developed narratives that would appear in later texts, but the seeds were being planted. The mythological imagination was at work, connecting different stories, harmonizing different traditions, creating ever more elaborate frameworks for understanding the divine. And the goddess, who had been present in the Vedas in various forms, as Ushas, the dawn, as Vak, the sacred speech, as Prithvi, the earth, began to be understood in more unified ways, as Shakti, as Devi, as the divine feminine principle that was not subordinate to the masculine but essential, the power without which even the greatest gods could not act. This was a slow emergence happening across different regions with different emphases. In some areas, the goddess traditions remained local and distinct. In others, they began to coalesce into pan-Indian forms, but the recognition of divine feminine power as fundamental to the cosmos was growing, deepening, preparing the ground for later developments. The period between the composition of the early Upanishads and the beginning of the Common Era was one of remarkable ferment. Buddhism and Jainism emerged during this time, offering alternative paths, challenging certain Vedic assumptions while accepting others, and the tradition that would come to be called Hinduism responded with its own creativity, its own evolution. The gods were not static figures. They were living presences in the imagination and devotion of countless people, and they grew, changed, absorbed influences, merged with local deities, took on regional characteristics, became simultaneously more universal and more particular, more philosophical and more accessible, more abstract and more personal. By the time the Common Era began, the foundations were in place for the great flooring that would come. The epics were being composed. The Puranas were beginning to take shape. New forms of devotion were emerging, and the gods of the Hindu tradition were ready to enter their classical period, their time of fullest elaboration and most magnificent storytelling. But that development belonged to the future. For now, in this early period, the essential patterns had been established, the questions had been asked, the paths had been marked, And the divine beings who would walk those paths with humanity for thousands of years to come had begun to reveal their natures, their stories, their inexhaustible capacity to meet human longing with forms both terrible and beautiful, both familiar and utterly beyond comprehension. The great turning came with the epics, those massive narrative oceans that would shape the religious imagination of the subcontinent for millennia, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Texts so vast and so embedded in cultural consciousness that they ceased to be merely stories and became something more like shared dreams, collective memories of a time when gods walked among mortals and every action carried cosmic weight. The Mahabharata, attributed to the sage Vyasa, grew over centuries through oral transmission and gradual accretion until it reached a length of some 100,000 verses, making it perhaps the longest poem ever composed, a work so encyclopedic that it contains within itself philosophies and myths and genealogies and legal discussions and romantic interludes and battlefield descriptions of stunning brutality. At its heart lies a family conflict, a war between cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, fighting for control of a kingdom. But this human drama unfolds against a backdrop of divine intervention, because the Pandavas are themselves semi-divine, born through blessings to mothers whose husbands could not produce heirs, Yudhishthira, son of Dharma itself, Bhima, son of the wind god, Arjuna, son of Indra, and the twins Nakula and Sahadeva, sons of the celestial horsemen. And most crucially, their companion and charioteer is Krishna, who appears first as a prince, a cowherd, a political advisor, a friend, but who reveals himself at the pivotal moment before battle as something infinitely greater, as Vishnu incarnate, as the Supreme Lord who contains all the gods within himself, all the worlds, all of time past and future. This revelation comes in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, that section of the epic that has become perhaps the most beloved and most commented upon text in the entire tradition. 700 verses of dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield, on the cusp of a war that will destroy most of the warriors assembled there. Arjuna falters, seeing his teachers and relatives and friends arrayed on both sides, recognizing that victory will require killing those he loves, and he lays down his weapons, refuses to fight, asks how such slaughter could ever be justified. And Krishna responds not with simple reassurance, but with teachings that unfold layer by layer, first addressing Arjuna's immediate concern, explaining that the soul is eternal, that bodies are merely garments changed from life to life, that the wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead because they understand the imperishable nature of the self. But the discourse deepens, expands. Krishna describes the path of selfless action, performing one's duty without attachment to results, acting in the world while remaining internally free. This is karma yoga, the way of engagement without bondage, of participation without entanglement. And then he speaks of devotion, of bhakti, of the path of loving surrender to the divine, describing how even those who cannot master meditation or renunciation can reach the highest goal through simple heartfelt worship, through offering flowers or water or even a leaf with sincere devotion, because what matters is not the grandeur of the offering, but the love with which it is given. And finally, when Arjuna asks to see Krishna's true form, the text describes a theophany, a vision of the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa, in which Arjuna perceives all of existence within Krishna's body, sees past and present and future simultaneously, sees gods and demons and humans being swallowed by time's inexorable flow, sees the entire universe as Krishna's play, his Leela, his dance of creation and dissolution. The description is overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful at once. Arjuna sees Krishna as the source of all, as time itself devouring the worlds, as the beginning and middle and end of all beings, and he trembles, asks to see again the familiar gentle form of his friend, because the cosmic vision is more than human consciousness can bear for long. This text, this dialogue, introduced ideas that would reshape devotional practice throughout the tradition, the notion that God could be approached as friend, as beloved, as intimate companion rather than merely as distant transcendent reality. The idea that grace mattered more than ritual precision, that sincerity counted more than birth or learning. Krishna himself became the focus of intense devotional movements. His childhood stories elaborated in the Puranas, tales of the divine infant stealing butter, lifting mountains to protect cowherds from storms, dancing on the heads of serpents, playing his flute in the forests of Vrindavan, while the gopis, the cowherd women, abandoned their duties to dance with him in the moonlight. These stories of Krishna's youthful exploits, his Ras Leela, his circular dance of divine love, became potent symbols of the soul's longing for union with the divine. The gopis' illicit love for Krishna read as metaphor for the way spiritual seekers must abandon worldly attachments, must risk everything, must transgress ordinary dharma itself in pursuit of the highest truth. And alongside Krishna, the other avatar stories multiplied. Vishnu's descent as Ramas in the Ramayana, that other great epic, the tale of the prince exiled from his kingdom through palace intrigue, wandering the forests with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana, facing the demon king Ravana who abducts Sita, building an army of monkeys and bears to cross the ocean to Lanka and rescue her. The Ramayana, attributed to the poet Valmiki, presents Rama as the ideal king, the perfect son, the devoted husband, Dharma embodied in human form, his story unfolding with a tragic grandeur, because even divine incarnations must suffer in the world of samsara, must face impossible choices and endure separation and loss. Sita herself becomes a model of virtue. Though later interpreters would struggle with aspects of her story, her trial by fire to prove her purity after rescue, her eventual abandonment by Rama due to public gossip, the text itself seems to recognize these tensions, these moments where Dharma demands cruelty, where righteousness requires sacrifice that feels unjust. But Rama's story also includes moments of profound devotion, particularly in the figure of Hanuman, the monkey god who serves Rama with absolute loyalty, who leaps across the ocean in a single bound, who carries mountains with healing herbs, who tears open his chest to show Rama and Sita enthroned in his heart. Hanuman became the exemplar of bhakti, of devotion so complete that it transcends all obstacles, so powerful that it grants superhuman strength and courage. These epics circulated through performance, through recitation, through traveling bards who would spend weeks or months telling the stories in villages across the subcontinent, and the gods within them became familiar presences, known intimately through repeated encounter, their personalities and preferences and stories woven into the fabric of daily life. And then came the Puranas, 18 major texts and numerous minor ones, encyclopedias of mythology and cosmology and genealogy, each Purana associated with one of the great gods: the Vishnu Purana, the Shiva Purana, the Devi Bhagavata Purana, texts that elaborated the myths hinted at in earlier sources, that created vast narrative universes around each deity. The Puranas describe the cycles of creation and dissolution, the kalpas and yugas, vast time periods that make human history seem like the blink of an eye. They describe how Brahma creates the universe from a lotus growing from Vishnu's navel, how that universe exists for billions of years before dissolving back into the cosmic ocean, how this cycle repeats endlessly, creation and destruction as the breath of the divine. They tell the story of the churning of the milk ocean, how gods and demons work together to extract the nectar of immortality, how Vishnu took the form of a beautiful woman to distract the demons while the gods drank the Amrita, how various treasures emerged from the churning, including Lakshmi herself, rising from the waters on a lotus, choosing Vishnu as her consort. They elaborate Shiva's mythology, his marriage to Sati, who immolates herself when her father insults her husband, Shiva's grief so intense that he carries her corpse across the world in a dance of mourning, her body parts falling to earth and becoming sacred sites, and then her rebirth as Parvati, the daughter of the mountains, who wins Shiva through devoted practice, through tapas, the ascetic heat that generates spiritual power. The Puranas describe Shiva's cosmic dance, the Tandava, performed in the hall with 1,000 pillars, his dance that creates and destroys the universe, his drum marking time, his hand raised in the gesture of fearlessness, his foot crushing the demon of ignorance, the circle of flames surrounding him representing the cycle of birth and death, this image becoming one of the most iconic in the entire tradition. They tell of Ganesha's birth, created by Parvati from the dirt of her own body, set to guard her door while she bathed, beheaded by Shiva, who did not recognize him, and then restored to life with an elephant's head, becoming the remover of obstacles, the lord of beginnings, the patron of writers and merchants, and anyone embarking on new endeavors. They describe the goddess in her many forms as Durga, riding a lion, created from the combined energies of all the gods to defeat the buffalo demon Mahishasura, who could not be killed by any male being, as Kali dancing on battlefields, wearing a garland of skulls, her tongue extended, fierce and terrible, yet also the loving mother who protects her devotees, as Saraswati in white garments, holding the Veena, seated on a lotus or a swan, embodying the flow of knowledge and artistic inspiration. These texts also systematize the practice of puja, the ritual worship that became central to Hindu devotional life, describing how to establish images in temples, how to invoke the deity's presence, how to offer flowers and incense and food, how to perform circumambulation, how to receive prasad, the blessed food that has been offered to and accepted by the god. The temple itself became understood as a cosmic diagram, a three-dimensional mandala, its architecture encoding philosophical and cosmological principles, the central shrine representing the cave of the heart, where the divine dwells, the towering superstructure symbolizing the sacred mountain, the circumambulatory path allowing devotees to honor the deity by walking around the sacred space. And different regions developed their own styles. the Nagara temples of the north with their curving towers, the Dravida temples of the south with their gopurams, gateway towers covered in sculpted figures, rising tier upon tier, entire cities built around temple complexes that became centers of learning and art and economic life. The gods enshrined in these temples were treated as royal persons, awakened in the morning, bathed and dressed, offered meals throughout the day, entertained with music and dance, put to bed at night. The ritualists, understanding that the infinite formless Brahman had graciously consented to dwell in the image, had accepted limitation out of compassion, making the divine accessible to those who needed form and presence. And alongside the grand temples, countless small shrines, roadside stones smeared with vermilion, trees wrapped in sacred thread, every village with its local manifestations of the great gods, its Gramadevata, its protective spirits and ancestors who might be fierce or benign, who required propitiation and respect, who mediated between the cosmic deities and everyday concerns. The philosophical schools also flourished during these centuries. Vedanta, in various forms, interpreting the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras and the Gita in different ways. Shankara, teaching absolute non-dualism, that only Brahman is real and the world is Maya, appearance, superimposition like the snake mistaken for a rope in dim light. Ramanuja, teaching a qualified non-dualism, that souls and the world are real but dependent on Brahman, like waves are real manifestations of the ocean, not separate, but also not merely illusory. His philosophy supporting devotional practice by affirming the reality of the personal God worthy of love and worship. Madhva teaching dualism, eternal distinction between God and souls, between the Creator and creation, 5 fundamental differences that are never overcome even in liberation. His vision preserving the devotional relationship while granting souls their own intrinsic reality, and the tantric traditions emerging, working with the body as a site of transformation, with kundalini energy rising through the chakras, with mantras and yantras and complex ritual practices, understanding the goddess as Shakti, the dynamic power that activates Shiva's static consciousness, the two eternally joined in the generative tension that produces all manifestation. These centuries saw an explosion of devotional poetry in regional languages, Tamil, Bengali, Marathi, Hindi, the saints singing of their love for Krishna or Rama or Shiva, Mirabai abandoning her royal status to wander as a devotee, Tulsidas retelling the Ramayana in a vernacular that made it accessible to those without Sanskrit, Kabir weaving together Hindu and Muslim imagery in verses that challenged orthodoxy and sectarian division. The gods became companions in this devotional outpouring, Krishna addressed as friend, as child, as lover, Rama revered as the perfect Lord worthy of service. Shiva approached through ecstatic identification, the devotees often describing states of possession, of merger, of love so intense it dissolved the boundaries of self. And as centuries passed into centuries, as empires rose and fell across the subcontinent, as languages evolved and arts flourished, and philosophies debated in temple courtyards and forest hermitages, the gods continued their own evolution, responding to new contexts, new questions, new longings in the hearts of those who called upon them. The medieval period brought waves of political change, sultanates, and then the Mughal Empire establishing Islamic rule over much of the subcontinent, and the Hindu tradition responded not with uniformity, but with its characteristic multiplicity. Some communities maintaining practices unchanged, others adapting, still others creating new syntheses that drew from multiple sources. The Bhakti movement intensified during these centuries, spreading across regions, crossing caste boundaries, challenging Brahminical authority through the radical claim that devotion mattered more than birth or learning, that a low-caste leather worker or a woman poet could achieve union with the divine through love alone, without elaborate rituals or scholarly knowledge of Sanskrit texts. The saints of this movement came from every stratum of society: Namdev the tailor, Kabir the weaver, Ravidas the cobbler. Their songs declaring that the divine dwelt not in temples alone, but in the heart of every sincere seeker, that external observances meant nothing without internal transformation, that the same truth could be called Krishna or Allah, Rama or Rahim, names pointing toward a reality beyond all naming. Chaitanya in Bengal danced through the streets in ecstatic devotion to Krishna, creating a movement that emphasized congregational singing, kirtan, the collective raising of voices in praise. His followers developing sophisticated theologies around the relationship between Krishna and the devotee, mapping the stages of love from initial attraction through deepening intimacy toward the ultimate union that preserves distinction even in merger. The Alvars and Nayanars in the Tamil South had pioneered this devotional intensity centuries earlier, singing in the vernacular, visiting temple after temple, their songs collected into sacred canons, the Nalayira Divya Prabandham for the Vaishnavas, the Tevaram for the Shaivas, texts that rivaled the Vedas in devotional authority, that demonstrated the power of love expressed in human languages rather than Sanskrit alone, and the goddess traditions flourished with particular intensity. The Devi Mahatmya, recounting how Durga slew Mahishasura, how Kali emerged from Durga's forehead to destroy demons, how the goddess in her various forms protected the cosmos when the gods themselves proved insufficient. These narratives affirming feminine divine power as supreme, as the source from which even the great male gods derived their efficacy. The Shakta Tantras describe the goddess as the ultimate reality, Shiva without Shakti reduced to a corpse, powerless, inert. Only through union with the feminine principle could consciousness actualize its creative potential. This theological vision supporting goddess worship as the highest path, Devi not as consort, but as the supreme deity herself. Regional forms of the goddess proliferated. Kali worshipped in Bengal with intense devotion, Ramakrishna in the 19th century spending hours in her temple, falling into trances, experiencing visions, teaching that all religions led to the same truth, but choosing to approach that truth through the form of the Divine Mother, his disciple Vivekananda, carrying this message to the West, introducing Hindu philosophy to audiences who had known nothing of it. The colonial period brought new challenges and transformations. British rule, imposing foreign categories on Hindu traditions, administrators attempting to codify laws, to systematize practices, to understand through their own frameworks a tradition that had always resisted singular definition. Hindu intellectuals responded variously, some internalizing colonial critiques, attempting to reform practices seen as backward, opposing child marriage, promoting widow remarriage, questioning caste discrimination, often drawing on ancient texts to argue that contemporary practices had deviated from original purity. Others asserted continuity and value, defending practices as expressions of profound philosophical truths misunderstood by outsiders, arguing that the tradition's diversity and tolerance exceeded anything found in Christianity or Islam. That idol worship reflected sophisticated understanding of the formless manifesting through form. The gods themselves became contested symbols, reformers sometimes arguing for a more abstract monotheism, suggesting that worship of multiple deities represented primitive superstition that educated Hindus should transcend, while traditionalists insisted on the validity of polytheistic practice, on the reality of the gods as distinct personalities worthy of devotion. Gandhi drew on the tradition selectively, using the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, as a political weapon against colonial rule, reading the Gita as a text about spiritual struggle rather than literal warfare. His interpretation innovative, yet presented as recovery of authentic meaning, the text's flexibility allowing for this creative reappropriation. He also elevated the figure of Rama, using the name Ram Raja, Rama's kingdom, to describe the ideal society he hoped independent India would become, though his vision emphasized justice and equality in ways that went beyond traditional interpretations. Rama reimagined as symbol of righteous governance rather than simply royal authority. Independence brought new questions about the relationship between religious tradition and modern nation-state, the secular constitution protecting religious freedom, while many continued to see Indian identity as fundamentally Hindu, the gods invoked in political rhetoric, temples becoming sites where national and religious identities merged and sometimes clashed. The 20th century also saw Hindu traditions spreading beyond the subcontinent through migration and missionary activity, yoga traveling to the West, first in rarefied forms taught by swamis to small groups of seekers, then gradually popularized, adapted, separated from its religious context, and repackaged as wellness practice, as fitness routine, as stress management technique. Meditation practices followed similar trajectories. Transcendental meditation offering mantras stripped of their devotional meanings, mindfulness drawing on Buddhist sources but finding ready adoption among those familiar with Hindu contemplative traditions, the boundaries between traditions blurring in diaspora contexts. The gods themselves acquired new forms and contexts. Krishna and Ganesha appearing on posters in college dorm rooms, their images aestheticized, commodified, divorced from ritual practice, yet still somehow carrying resonance, still pointing towards something seekers found meaningful even when translated into utterly foreign settings. ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, established temples around the world, introducing Westerners to ecstatic devotion, to kirtan and prasad, and the philosophy of Chaitanya's lineage, their translation of the Bhagavad Gita spreading widely, becoming for many their first encounter with Hindu texts. Though traditionalists sometimes question the movement's innovations and evangelistic approach, Hindu communities in diaspora built temples that became cultural centers, places where immigrant families could maintain connections to tradition, where children could learn languages and stories and practices their parents feared might otherwise be lost. The gods presiding over community gatherings that were simultaneously religious and social, devotional and ethnic, and back in India, the tradition continued its internal debates and developments, new gurus arising, some controversial, some revered, all claiming to offer authentic paths while often innovating freely, combining traditional elements in novel ways, using modern media to spread their messages, attracting followers who might seek spiritual guidance while remaining skeptical of institutional religion. The gods appeared in new media, in calendar art, in comic books, in television serials that became cultural phenomena, entire communities gathering to watch episodes of the Ramayana or Mahabharata. The gods' stories told through these modern forms, reaching audiences far larger than any temple ritual or scripture recitation could access. Films explored mythological themes, sometimes reverently, sometimes playfully, sometimes controversially. The gods, as characters in narratives that might affirm tradition or question it, that might present them as literal beings or as psychological symbols. The interpretive possibilities as multiple as the tradition itself, and philosophical explorations continued, scholars and practitioners debating the meaning of ancient texts, producing new commentaries on the Upanishads and Gita, arguing about whether Vedanta pointed toward non-dualism or theism or something that escaped these categories altogether, the tradition's intellectual vitality undiminished by modernity's challenges. The environmental movement found resources in Hindu traditions, ideas of the earth as goddess, of rivers as sacred, of trees as worthy of reverence. These concepts deployed in conservation efforts, used to argue for environmental protection on religious grounds, though critics noted the gap between ideals and practices, between reverence for nature in principle and its exploitation in fact. Feminist scholars grappled with the tradition's complex legacy, finding empowerment in goddess worship, yet also critiquing patriarchal structures, celebrating Sita and Draupadi, yet questioning the constraints imposed on women in their names, recovering forgotten female saints and philosophers while challenging interpretations that subordinated women, the goddesses themselves becoming sites of contested meaning. And through all these transformations, through colonialism and independence, through diaspora and globalization, through modernization and its discontents, the gods remained, not unchanged, never unchanged, but continuous, recognizable, their stories still told, their names still invoked, their images still venerated in temples, ancient and newly built, in homes and roadside shrines, in the inner sanctums of hearts, still seeking meaning through forms inherited from countless generations. The tradition that had begun with Vedic hymns beside ritual fires had become something vast and varied beyond any simple description, encompassing philosophy and devotion, ritual and meditation, social structures and personal quests. Inclusive of countless local variations and sectarian distinctions, yet somehow also unified by shared stories and symbols and practices. To speak of the gods of Hinduism in the singular was to falsify through oversimplification, yet to catalog every regional form and theological interpretation would be to drown in detail without grasping the patterns, the family resemblances, the themes that recurred across contexts. These were gods who created and destroyed, who descended and withdrew, who demanded sacrifice, yet also granted grace freely, who embodied contradictions without being contradictory, who were one and many simultaneously, who were ultimate reality and also personalities with preferences and moods, who transcended all form yet welcomed worship through images, who had existed forever yet also manifested in historical time. And perhaps this multiplicity, this refusal of singular definition, this comfort with paradox and plurality, was itself the deepest truth the tradition offered. Not a bug, but a feature, not confusion, but sophistication, a recognition that the infinite could not be captured in any single formulation, that the divine necessarily appeared differently to different seekers in different circumstances. That truth itself was too large for uniformity. The gods had journeyed far from those Vedic fire altars, yet they remained connected to them. The hymns still chanted, the rituals still performed, the questions still asked. Continuity and change braided together like the Ganges and Yamuna at their confluence, distinct yet flowing together toward an ocean that contained them both. The deepening quiet of contemplation draws the mind toward patterns, toward the shapes that emerge when stepping back from individual stories, from particular deities, toward the underlying currents that flow through thousands of years of devotion and speculation. There is a quality to these gods that resists the categories often applied to them. To call them merely metaphors feels reductive, as if those who prostrated before their images or sang their names were engaged in some elaborate misunderstanding. Yet to insist on their literal objective existence in the way a mountain exists also misses something essential, some flexibility, some creative interplay between the divine and the devotee that makes the relationship more dynamic than simple realism allows. The tradition itself seems comfortable with this ambiguity, with affirming that the gods are real, while also explaining them as aspects of Brahman, as Maya, as Lala, as play and illusion and manifestation all at once, the philosophical and the devotional held together without requiring resolution into singular truth. Consider the concept of Ista Devata, the chosen deity, the recognition that different practitioners might focus devotion on different gods, not because one is true and others false, but because different personalities resonate with different aspects of the infinite. Some drawn to Shiva's asceticism, others to Krishna's playfulness, still others to the fierce protection of Kali, each valid, each offering a genuine path, the diversity celebrated rather than suppressed. Or consider the narratives themselves, the way stories contradict without anxiety. Ganesha's birth told differently in different texts. The goddess described as Shiva's wife in some contexts and as the supreme power from which he emerges in others, the chronology impossible to reconcile if treated as history, yet perfectly coherent as mythology, as truth expressed through story rather than through chronicle. The gods teach through their contradictions. Shiva, the ascetic, who is also the householder, the destroyer who preserves through destroying, the master of yoga who dances in ecstatic abandon. These are not flaws in the characterization, but invitations to deeper understanding, to recognizing that ultimate reality cannot be confined to comfortable categories, that the divine necessarily exceeds human logic, and the avatars of Vishnu encode a cosmological vision, the progression from fish to tortoise to boar, to man-lion to dwarf to warrior, sometimes read as evolutionary sequence, sometimes as myth cycle, always as demonstration that the divine takes whatever form is needed, that there is no situation so desperate, no crisis so severe that intervention cannot come, even if it comes in unexpected guise. The goddess traditions perhaps probe most deeply into paradox. Kali dancing on Shiva's corpse, yet also the nurturing mother. Durga created by the gods, yet superior to them, Saraswati's gentle wisdom and Kali's fierce destruction understood as aspects of single feminine principle, the tradition refusing to separate the creative and destructive, the beautiful and terrible, insisting they are inseparable, that life feeds on death, that creation requires destruction, that the mother who gives life also takes it away. There is also the question of darshan, the seeing and being seen by the deity. This practice that makes temple worship not about asking favors or performing obligations, but about encountering presence, about standing before the image and allowing oneself to be beheld, to be known, the eyes of the god, meeting the eyes of the devotee in an exchange that is somehow mutual, despite the vast disparity in being and the festivals that punctuate the year. Diwali's lights welcoming Lakshmi, Navaratri's 9 nights honoring the goddess, Holi's colors celebrating Krishna's play, Mahashivaratri's vigil of fasting and meditation, these rhythms connecting communities, marking time not just chronologically, but mythologically, allowing participants to enter sacred time, to reenact cosmic events, to align their lives with divine patterns. The practice of mantra carries its own depths. The repetition of names, of syllables, of entire hymns, the sound itself considered powerful, transformative, the vibration altering consciousness, not through meaning alone, but through resonance, through the physical experience of speaking or hearing sacred speech. Om Namah Shivaya, Hare Krishna, Om Aim Sarasvatyai Namah. Each formula a key opening particular doors, invoking particular presences, and the sacred geography that maps the divine onto landscape, the 7 sacred cities, the 12 Jyotirlingas, the 51 Shakti Pithas, pilgrimage routes connecting these sites, millions walking for days or weeks to bathe in rivers made holy by mythological events, to climb mountains where gods meditated, to circumambulate temples that mark where the divine touched earth, the land itself sacralized through story, every rock and river potentially the site of ancient events, of ongoing presence. The arts too become vehicles for the divine. Classical dance depicting stories of Krishna and Shiva, each gesture codified, each movement laden with meaning, the dancer not performing about the gods, but embodying them, becoming for the duration of the dance a living icon, music as devotion, ragas as offerings, the boundaries between aesthetic experience and religious practice dissolving, and always the texts, the endless production of commentaries and poems and philosophical treatises, each generation adding to the conversation, interpreting, reinterpreting, finding new meanings in ancient words, the tradition alive because it continues to generate thought, to provoke questions, to demand engagement rather than passive acceptance. Perhaps what distinguishes this pantheon is its refusal of finality, its comfort with ongoing elaboration, with regional variations and sectarian developments that splinter and recombine without destroying underlying unity, the way Hinduism encompasses rather than excludes, how it absorbs local deities into larger frameworks, how it allows for both monotheism and polytheism, both personal God and impersonal absolute, both this worldly engagement and renunciation, the capacity to hold contradictions not as problems to solve, but as truths to honor. The gods remain inexhaustible. After thousands of years, after countless stories and songs and philosophical analyses, they still generate new meanings, still speak to contemporary concerns, still offer forms through which the formless can be approached, still invite the devotion and contemplation and creative engagement that keeps a tradition living rather than merely preserved. And so the journey through these divine presences begins to curve back toward stillness, toward the quiet from which it emerged, the stories told, the patterns observed, the questions raised and left hanging in the air like incense, smoke drifting upward. The gods of the Hindu tradition are not artifacts, not relics of a superseded worldview. They are living realities for hundreds of millions, presences invoked daily in temples and homes, in moments of crisis and moments of celebration, their names on the lips of the dying and the newborn, woven so deeply into culture and consciousness that to extract them would be to unravel the entire fabric. Yet they are also more than communal heritage, more than ethnic tradition. They are explorations of the possible relationships between human and divine, between finite and infinite, between the urgency of embodied life and the peace of transcendence. Each god a different question, a different answer, a different path up the mountain that all paths climb. To have spent this time in their presence, to have followed their evolution from Vedic hymns, through epic narratives, through devotional movements, through modern reinterpretations, is to have traced one of humanity's longest continuous conversations, one of our most sustained attempts to give form to the formless, to make the infinite intimate, to bridge the chasm between the mortal and the eternal. The images remain: Vishnu on his serpent, Shiva in meditation, Ganesha with his broken tusk, Durga on her lion, Krishna with his flute, each one a doorway, an invitation, a promise that the divine can be known, not fully, never fully, but genuinely, that grace flows toward those who seek, that presence answers the call of longing. And perhaps in the end, what these gods offer is not solutions, but companionship, not answers, but deepening questions, not escape from the human condition, but sacred interpretation of it. They suffer and love and create and destroy alongside those who worship them. They are both utterly other and strangely familiar, both far beyond and somehow near. The temple bells ring at dusk. The arati flames circle before the images. Voices rise in ancient Sanskrit and contemporary vernaculars. And for a moment, the boundaries thin between past and present, between myth and history, between the world as it is and the world as it might be if the divine truly dwelt within it. The Ganges continues its flow. The mountains stand in their eternal patience. The stories are told again to children who will tell them to their children. And the gods remain, shifting, evolving, responding to new devotions and new doubts, as inexhaustible as the human capacity for wonder, as enduring as the questions that wake us in the darkness and follow us into light. The narratives could continue forever. Each god has 1,000 names, each name a story, each story branching into others, the tradition structured like a fractal, the same patterns repeating at every scale, infinity contained in finite forms, the many and the one engaged in eternal conversation. But there is also value in silence, in allowing the words to slow, to space themselves further apart, to recognize that some truths live in the pauses between statements, in the resonance that lingers after the bell has been struck, in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, where something immense and ancient breathes with patience that makes human time seem like the flutter of leaves. The gods have been generous, sharing their stories, allowing themselves to be discussed and analyzed and contemplated, but they are not exhausted by this attention. They remain, always more to discover, always depths unplumbed, always new aspects to reveal to those who seek with sincerity and devotion. And so the story finds its end, though not conclusion, because these gods have no conclusion. They continue in temples and hearts, in texts being studied and rituals being performed, in questions being asked by new generations, in the eternal return of seasons and festivals, in the ongoing dialogue between the human and the divine. The mist rises from the river, the shapes within it becoming indistinct, fading back into formlessness, but not disappearing, never disappearing, only withdrawing, waiting, ready to manifest again when called upon, when needed, when devotion creates the space for presence. The journey completes, the circle closes, the telling rests, and in the stillness that follows, perhaps something remains, some residue of wonder, some echo of the infinite, some recognition that these gods, in all their multiplicity and contradiction, point toward a reality that exceeds all naming, all knowing, all telling. And the final words drift away like smoke, like morning mist, like prayers carried on the wind, toward mountains where gods have meditated since before time began, dissolving into silence, into peace, into the vast and gentle darkness where all stories begin, and to which all stories, in the end, return. There is a place far to the north where the land meets the sea in 1,000 different ways, where fjords cut deep into ancient stone and islands scatter like seeds across cold waters, where forests stand thick with pine and birch, and the light changes with the seasons in ways that seem impossible, almost magical. This is a world shaped by ice and fire, by mountains that rise from the ocean, by winters that stretch long and dark, and summers when the sun barely sets at all. And in this world, centuries ago, there lived people who knew how to survive, how to thrive in a landscape that demanded everything from them. They were farmers and craftsmen, sailors and traders, storytellers and explorers, and though history would give them a single name, they were never just one thing, never simply warriors or raiders, but communities of families, children and elders, people who woke each morning to tend their animals, to mend their tools, to weave cloth and shape iron, to tell stories by firelight and plan for the seasons ahead. Imagine standing on a shore in what we now call Scandinavia, sometime around the 8th century, when the world was quieter, when travel meant weeks or months, when most people lived and died within a day's walk of where they were born. The air tastes of salt and pine, carries the cry of gulls overhead, and from somewhere behind you comes the sound of an axe biting wood, rhythmic and steady, the work of someone preparing for winter, always preparing. The water before you stretches gray and restless, and pulled up on the beach, resting on wooden rollers, is a ship unlike any other in the world at that time, long and narrow, with a curved prow that rises like the neck of a dragon or a serpent, its hull made from overlapping planks of oak, each one carefully shaped, fitted so precisely that the whole vessel flexes with the waves, bends rather than breaks, designed by generations of shipwrights who learned their craft from fathers and grandfathers, who understood that the sea requires both strength and flexibility. Nearby, smoke rises from a longhouse, a building that might stretch 30 or 40 meters in length, its walls made of timber or stone, its roof thick with turf that will insulate against the brutal cold. Inside that building, a family shares their space with their livestock during winter, the warmth of cattle and sheep helping everyone survive, the smell of animals mixing with wood smoke and the earth itself. This is not a world of great cities, not yet, but of scattered farms and small settlements, places where a dozen families might cluster together, sharing resources, sharing labor during harvest, gathering in the longhouse for feasts and assemblies, for the telling of stories that preserve memory, that teach the young, that connect everyone to their ancestors and their gods. Around you, if you could see far enough, this landscape repeats itself up and down the coasts of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, each inlet and valley holding communities that are similar but distinct, speaking dialects of the same language, worshiping the same gods with regional variations, connected by sea routes and trade, by marriage alliances and occasional conflicts, each community adapting to its particular environment, to the depth of its harbor, the richness of its soil, the density of its forests. And in these communities, life follows rhythms that are ancient, dictated by the sun and the seasons, by the needs of crops and animals, by the patterns of fish in the sea. Winter is a time of indoor work, of repairing tools and making cloth, of carving and storytelling, while summer demands nearly constant labor, planting and tending, fishing and preserving, cutting hay and gathering wood, always preparing for the next winter, always aware that survival depends on planning, on skill, on community. The people themselves are not so different from people anywhere. They laugh and argue, fall in love and raise children, mourn their dead and celebrate their harvests. They worry about the weather and their neighbors, about whether the crops will succeed, about their standing in the community, about their children's futures. They are human in all the ordinary ways, and yet they are also shaped by this particular place, by the demands of these northern lands, by a culture that values independence and courage, that honors skill and resourcefulness, that remembers its stories with remarkable precision. This is where we begin, on this shore, in this moment, watching smoke rise from distant farmsteads, hearing the lap of waves against the hull of that extraordinary ship, feeling the wind that blows from the mountains, cold even in summer, carrying the scent of snow that never entirely melts from the highest peaks. The people who would come to be known as Vikings did not appear suddenly, did not emerge all at once as raiders or explorers, but grew from communities that had lived in Scandinavia for thousands of years, communities that evolved slowly, adapting to the northern climate, developing technologies and traditions that would eventually allow them to reach far beyond their homelands, long before the first longships touched foreign shores, before the first raids on distant monasteries. These northern lands were home to farmers and fishermen, to people who had learned to cultivate barley and rye in short growing seasons, who raised cattle and sheep and pigs, who supplemented their diet with fish from the seas and rivers, with seals and whales, with wild game from the forests. Survival in this landscape required deep knowledge, and understanding of weather patterns and animal behavior, of which plants could be eaten and which could heal, of how to preserve food through the long, dark months when nothing grew. The transition from the earlier Iron Age into what we call the Viking Age was gradual, marked not by a single event, but by accumulating changes, improvements in shipbuilding that made longer voyages possible, increases in population that created pressure on available farmland, the development of new trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the wider world, and perhaps most importantly, shifts in social organization, the emergence of chieftains and minor kings who could organize larger groups, who could command resources and loyalty, who could outfit expeditions beyond the familiar waters. In the centuries before the Viking Age proper, Scandinavian communities were already seafarers, already traders, using boats to travel between settlements along the coast, to reach islands that offered good fishing or grazing, to trade furs and amber and iron for goods they couldn't produce themselves. But these earlier vessels were different, shorter and wider, less suited to the open ocean, built for coastal waters and known routes. They served their purpose, but limited how far anyone could go, how much they could carry, how quickly they could move. The breakthrough came gradually, shipwrights experimenting with design, learning that a longer, narrower hull could move faster, that overlapping planks, a technique called clinker building, created a hull that was both strong and flexible, that a single large square sail could harness the wind more effectively than rowing alone, though rowing remained essential. Banks of oars on each side allowing precise control in harbors and rivers, allowing movement even when the wind failed. These innovations didn't happen all at once, but accumulated over generations, each master shipwright making small improvements, passing knowledge to apprentices, until by the late 8th century, Scandinavian ships were the finest in Europe, perhaps the finest in the world. With these new vessels came new possibilities. A farm in Norway might have good land, but not enough of it, might support one son, but not three. And so younger sons looked outward, looked to the sea, knowing that across the water lay other lands, some inhabited, some not, places where a man might establish his own farm, might gain wealth through trade or through taking, might build a reputation that would live in story. This combination of need and opportunity and technological capability created the conditions for expansion, for the movements and migrations that would define the Viking Age. But before that expansion began in earnest, before the raids that would shock Christian Europe, life in Scandinavian communities followed patterns that had been established for centuries. The rhythm of the agricultural year dominated everything. Spring meant preparing fields, repairing fences and tools, bringing livestock out to pasture after the confinement of winter, planting the precious seeds of barley and rye, of oats and vegetables, knowing that everything depended on the weather, on sufficient rain but not too much, on the absence of late frosts that could kill young plants, on a summer long enough for crops to ripen. Summer was the season of constant work, tending the growing crops, fishing when weather permitted, cutting and drying hay for winter fodder. The entire community engaged in labor that allowed no rest. Children old enough to walk had tasks, gathering eggs, watching younger siblings, helping in the fields, while adults worked from the early light until late evening, taking advantage of the long days when the sun barely set, storing up against the dark months ahead. Autumn brought harvest, a time of both celebration and anxiety. Would there be enough? Had the weather been kind, the barley cut and threshed, the vegetables gathered and stored, animals that couldn't be fed through winter slaughtered and preserved, the meat smoked or salted or dried, every scrap used, nothing wasted in a world where waste meant death. And then as the days shortened and the cold deepened, the community drew inward into the longhouse, into the season of darkness and stories. These longhouses were remarkable structures, the center of family and community life, built with timber from the forests, each tree selected and felled with care, shaped with axes and adzes, fitted together with wooden pegs and iron nails that were precious, valuable. The walls, sometimes timber, sometimes stone, sometimes a combination built thick against the cold, and the roof covered with turf, living earth layered over birch bark, creating insulation that worked remarkably well, that kept the interior warm even when snow piled high outside. Inside the longhouse, the layout followed a pattern, a central hearth providing light and warmth, benches along the walls where people sat during the day and slept at night, storage areas for food and tools and precious possessions. At one end, separated by a partition, the byre where animals lived during winter, their body heat adding to the warmth, their presence a constant reminder of the integration of human and animal life, of the dependence on livestock for survival, for milk and meat and leather and wool, for the manure that fertilized the fields. The social organization of these early communities was complex, built on kinship and obligation, on honor and reputation. At the center was the family, not just parents and children, but extended networks of relatives, cousins and uncles and aunts, grandparents when they survived to old age, all connected by bonds of mutual support and mutual responsibility. What happened to one member of the family affected all, brought honor or shame to all, created obligations that might last generations. Beyond family were larger structures, the community of a settlement, perhaps a dozen or 20 families living near enough to help each other, to gather for assemblies called things where disputes were settled, where decisions affecting everyone were made, where law was spoken aloud and remembered, not written down, but preserved in the memories of those who attended, passed from generation to generation. These assemblies were remarkably democratic in some ways. Free men could speak, could bring grievances, could participate in judgments, though influence often correlated with wealth and reputation, with the ability to gather supporters, to offer compelling arguments, to invoke precedent and tradition. Above the local community level, there were chieftains, men who commanded greater resources, who could call upon larger numbers of followers, who settled more serious disputes, who led raids or trading expeditions, who hosted feasts that reinforced their status and created obligations. These chieftains were not absolute rulers, not kings in the later sense, but first among equals, powerful because of their wealth and their generosity, their ability to reward followers, their success in battle or trade, their wisdom in judgment. A chieftain who failed, who was ungenerous or cowardly or foolish, might find his followers drifting away, attaching themselves to someone more worthy of loyalty. Religion in these early communities was deeply woven into daily life, not separate from ordinary activities, but part of everything. The gods were real presences. Odin, the All-Father, wise and terrible, associated with war and poetry and magic. Thor with his hammer, protector against giants and chaos. Beloved by farmers who needed his rain and his strength. Freyr and Freya, associated with fertility and prosperity, with the success of crops and the birth of children, and many others, each with their particular qualities and stories, their relationships and conflicts that mirrored human experience. Worship happened at many scales, personal offerings at small shrines, community gatherings at sacred groves or sites, larger festivals marking the turning of the seasons. These weren't somber occasions, but celebrations, feasting and drinking, sacrifices of animals, and the sharing of meat, the strengthening of community bonds, the acknowledgement of powers greater than human, of forces that controlled the weather and the harvest, that determined success or failure, life or death, and through it all, the presence of stories, myths and legends, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but preserving essential truths, teaching values and explaining the world, connecting the present to the past and to the realm of the gods. In these communities, before the expansion began, life was hard, but not without joy. There was pride in skill, in being a master of some craft, a skilled shipwright or blacksmith, a weaver of fine cloth, or a carver of intricate designs. There was pleasure in stories well told, in the gathering of friends and family, in the taste of meat and mead at a feast, in the satisfaction of work done well, of a ship that sailed true, of a field that yielded grain, of children growing strong. The world was dangerous, full of threats both visible and invisible, but it was also home, familiar and beloved, the land of ancestors and descendants, the place where one belonged. And then something shifted, sometime in the late 8th century, when the ships had become capable of longer voyages, when populations had grown and younger sons sought their fortunes, when rumors of wealthy monasteries and undefended coasts reached Scandinavian ears. The first raids began, small expeditions at first, testing the waters, learning what was possible. The raid on Lindisfarne in the year 793, on a monastery off the coast of Northumbria, sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Monks slaughtered or taken as slaves, treasures looted, sacred objects treated as mere plunder. The attack seemed to come from nowhere, ships appearing suddenly, warriors pouring ashore, violence swift and brutal, and then departure before any defense could be organized, the sea that had protected the monastery becoming a highway for attackers, for men who read waves and currents as farmers read soil and sky. But these raids, shocking as they were to those attacked, were not the whole story, not even the main story of what was happening. They were one strategy among many, one way that Scandinavians engaged with the wider world, alongside trade and exploration, alongside settlement and integration. The same ships that carried raiders could carry merchants. The same men who fought could also negotiate, could marry into local families, could become farmers in new lands. The Viking Age was complex, contradictory, impossible to reduce to a single narrative. Consider a typical expedition planned over winter in a longhouse somewhere in Norway or Denmark, a chieftain gathering men, younger sons with little inheritance, adventurers seeking reputation, experienced sailors who knew the routes, a ship prepared, provisions loaded, dried fish and meat, water in sealed containers, tools and weapons, trade goods for peaceful exchange, the departure timed for favorable weather, family and friends gathered on the shore, offerings made to the gods for safe passage, and then the pushing off, the rowing through calm waters, the raising of the sail when the wind was right, the ship responding like a living thing, leaping forward across the waves. The navigation required for these voyages was extraordinary. No compasses, no charts as we understand them, but deep knowledge passed from experienced sailors to those learning the craft. The sun's position during the day, the stars at night, the North Star holding steady while others wheeled around it, the color and temperature of the water, the behavior of birds and sea creatures, the smell of land carried on the wind, the pattern of waves that indicated distant shores. Some navigators may have used sunstones, crystals that could locate the sun even through clouds, though the exact techniques remain debated. What's certain is that Viking sailors reached Iceland, Greenland, the coast of North America, crossed the North Sea and the Baltic, traveled up rivers deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine, their knowledge encoded not in writing but in experience and memory, in the ability to read the natural world with precision. When they reached foreign shores, what happened next varied enormously. Sometimes there was violence, raids on monasteries and towns that held wealth, fighting that was brutal and efficient. The Vikings had advantages, mobility from their ships, the element of surprise, equipment and training that made them formidable, their axes and swords and spears wielded by men who had practiced from childhood, who wore mail if they could afford it, who carried round shields of wood and leather, who fought in loose formations that allowed individual skill to shine while still supporting each other. But often, perhaps more often than the chronicles suggest, there was trade. Merchants from Scandinavia bringing furs and amber, walrus ivory and slaves, iron and timber, seeking silver and silk, spices and wine, glass and fine weapons. The trading networks of the Viking Age stretched from Baghdad to Byzantium, from the markets of Hedeby in Denmark to the great rivers of Russia. Viking merchants established settlements at key points: Jorvik in England, Dublin in Ireland, Novgorod and Kiev in the east. These became cosmopolitan centers, places where Scandinavians lived alongside Celts and Anglo-Saxons, Slavs and Arabs, where cultures mixed, where Christianity and the old gods existed side by side, where new identities emerged. In these settlements, daily life took on patterns different from the homeland, but recognizably similar. There were still farms to tend, still livestock to care for, still the rhythms of planting and harvest, but there were also new opportunities. Craftsmen specialized in ways not possible in smaller communities. Blacksmiths who worked only in metal, leather workers and shoemakers, jewelers who created intricate brooches and arm rings, potters and glass workers, shipwrights who built vessels for trade rather than warfare, merchants who never farmed but lived entirely from commerce, the movement of goods across vast distances. The integration of Vikings into foreign lands happened gradually. A warrior who came on a raid might return the next year to trade, might settle, might marry a local woman and convert to Christianity to do so, might raise children who spoke Norse at home, but the local language in the market, who worshipped Christ in public, but perhaps still made offerings to Thor in private. Within a few generations, The descendants of Vikings in Normandy or England or Ireland were no longer purely Scandinavian, but hybrids, carrying some traditions forward while adopting others, creating new cultures that blended elements from multiple sources. Back in Scandinavia, the wealth flowing in from raids and trade had profound effects. Silver came in vast quantities, hoarded in buried treasures that archaeologists still find, melted down and made into arm rings and neck rings, into hack silver that could be cut up and used as currency. This wealth concentrated in the hands of successful chieftains, allowing them to build larger halls, to host more elaborate feasts, to attract more followers. Gradually, some of these chieftains became kings, rulers over larger territories, able to enforce their will over wider areas, though always with the understanding that power was earned, maintained through success and generosity, never simply inherited as absolute right. The social transformations were accompanied by technological ones. Metalworking reached new heights of sophistication. Patterned welded swords with cores of different iron types twisted together, edges hardened to hold a killing sharpness, hilts decorated with precious metals and intricate designs. These weapons were valuable, named, passed down through generations, appearing in stories and poems. A good sword was both tool and treasure, symbol of status and actual instrument of power. Women in Viking society occupied complex positions. They could own property, inherit land, divorce their husbands under certain circumstances, run farms when men were away on expeditions that might last months or years. They were weavers and brewers, managers of households that were economic units in their own right. Some women were buried with weapons, were remembered in stories as shield maidens, though how common such warriors actually were remains uncertain. What's clear is that women were essential, not marginalized, but central to the functioning of society. Their work in textile production alone was crucial. Wool turned into cloth through endless hours of spinning and weaving, cloth that could be traded. That was wealth in a form different from silver but equally real. The crafts of daily life were practiced with remarkable skill. Woodworking that created everything from ships to spoons, furniture and buildings, bowls and buckets, carved with designs that ranged from simple to extraordinarily complex, interlaced patterns that seemed to have no beginning or end, animals twisted into impossible positions, dragons and serpents and creatures from mythology. These weren't merely decorative, but meaningful, connecting the object to stories, to beliefs about the nature of reality, to the constant presence of other realms beyond the visible world. Textile production involved technologies we've largely forgotten. Plants gathered and processed for dyes, madder for red, woad for blue, various plants for yellows and browns, the knowledge of which plant produced which color, how to prepare it, how to fix the dye so it wouldn't fade. This was specialized knowledge, passed from women to daughters and apprentices. The resulting cloth could be plain or patterned, simple or incredibly complex. Some fragments show skill that rivals anything produced before the industrial age. Tiny stitches, intricate patterns, evidence of hours and hours of work, of pride and craft, of the creation of beauty as part of ordinary life. The blacksmith occupied a special place in Viking society, working with fire and iron, transforming raw ore into tools and weapons, nails and rivets and hinges. everything that held the material world together. The smith's forge was a place of mystery, of transformation, where the hard became soft in the heat, where hammering could shape metal into new forms, where quenching in water locked in desired properties. The smith needed knowledge, when to heat and when to hammer, how to recognize the color of iron that indicated the right temperature, how to create steel by adding carbon, how to pattern weld. The best smiths were valued, their products sought after, their skills praised in poetry. Food in Viking communities was simpler than in the courts of Christian Europe, but not without variety. Bread made from barley or rye, porridge of oats, vegetables from gardens, cabbage and onions, peas and beans, fruit when available, apples and berries gathered from the wild, fish in many forms, dried and salted and smoked, herring and cod, salmon from the rivers, meat from domestic animals and from hunting, venison and wild boar, seabirds and their eggs, dairy products, milk and butter, cheese preserved for winter and for special occasions. For feasts there was more, roasted meat in quantity, mead made from honey, ale brewed from barley, the drinking that accompanied storytelling, that built bonds between warriors and between families, that sealed agreements and celebrated victories. The feasts themselves were crucial social occasions, times when obligations were created and reinforced, when a chieftain demonstrated his wealth and generosity, when poets recited verses praising the host, when the past was remembered and the future planned. The hall filled with people, firelight gleaming on decorated beams, on wall hangings that showed scenes from mythology, on the faces of listeners as stories unfolded. The skalds, the poets, commanded attention. Their verses were not written but composed and performed, memorized and passed on. They were historians and entertainers, preservers of genealogy and deeds. Their words carried weight, could increase reputation or damage it, could ensure that a name lived on or was forgotten. The Viking Age did not end suddenly, did not conclude with a single battle or event, but faded gradually over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, transformed by forces both external and internal, by the spread of Christianity, by the consolidation of kingdoms, by changing trade patterns, and the strengthening of defenses in lands that had once been vulnerable. The world that had made Viking expansion possible was changing, becoming less hospitable to the old ways, more resistant to raids, more integrated into larger political and religious structures. Christianity came to Scandinavia slowly, unevenly, carried by missionaries and returning traders, by kings who saw advantages in aligning with the dominant religion of Europe. The old gods did not disappear overnight, but gradually receded. Temples became churches, sometimes literally, the same sacred sites serving new purposes. Thor's hammer amulets worn alongside crosses. The transition a matter of generations, of children raised with different stories, different understandings of the world and what lay beyond it. In Norway, the process was pushed by kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, who saw Christianity as a tool for consolidation, for building authority that transcended local chieftains and their traditional powers. Conversion was sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced. The smashing of idols, the destruction of sacred groves, the building of churches on sites that had honored other gods, but it was also sincere, people genuinely convinced, finding in Christianity answers that satisfied them, community in the new church, connection to the wider Christian world, and for the kings, alliance with bishops and priests who could read and write, who could create administrative systems, who brought technologies of governance that had evolved in southern Europe. In Denmark and Sweden, the transformation followed similar patterns, but with local variations. Danish kings like Harald Bluetooth embracing Christianity, raising rune stones that proclaimed the new faith, building churches, establishing dioceses, integrating Denmark into Christendom while maintaining distinct Scandinavian identity. In Sweden, the process was slower, Uppsala remaining a center of the old religion longer than sites in Norway or Denmark. The temple there described in later accounts as magnificent and terrible, hung with gold, where sacrifices were made every 9 years. Though how accurate these descriptions are is uncertain, written by Christians looking back, perhaps exaggerating the paganism they were replacing. The great expeditions continued into the 11th century but changed in character, less about raiding, more about conquest and settlement, about establishing kingdoms that could be held and administered in England. Knut the Great ruled an empire that included Denmark, Norway, parts of Sweden, a Scandinavian king sitting on the English throne, patronizing churches, minting coins, governing through a mix of Norse and English nobles, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely one nor the other, though his empire fragmented after his death, unable to sustain itself without his personal authority. In Normandy, the descendants of Vikings who had settled there in the early 10th century became French in language and culture, became Christians who built monasteries and cathedrals, who forgot the old gods, who spoke of their Scandinavian ancestors as figures from a distant past, and yet they retained something, a tradition of military prowess, of naval capability, of administrative innovation that would culminate in the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror claiming the English throne, bringing Norman feudalism, building castles, transforming the landscape of power. And though he was French in culture, there was Norse blood in his veins, Viking heritage in the determination and strategic thinking that won him a kingdom. In the east, the Rus, Scandinavians who had established themselves along the river routes through what is now Russia and Ukraine, became integrated into Slavic populations, adopted Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium, created states that would evolve into Russia and Ukraine. The princes of Kiev maintaining some Norse traditions, some memory of origins in Sweden, but increasingly Slavic in language and culture, the transformation nearly complete by the 11th century, the Scandinavian element absorbed, incorporated into something new. In Iceland, settled by Norwegians fleeing the consolidation of royal power, the Viking Age persisted longer in some ways. The Althing, the General Assembly, met from the year 930, making it one of the oldest parliaments in the world, free farmers gathering to make laws and settle disputes, maintaining something of the old independence, the old democratic traditions of the thing, though Iceland too would eventually accept Christianity. In the year 1000, the decision made at the Althing, a remarkable moment when an entire society chose collectively to change its official religion while allowing private worship of the old gods to continue for a time. The sagas were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, composed in the unique literary language of Old Norse, preserving stories of the settlement period, of feuds and heroes, of voyages to Vinland, to North America centuries before Columbus. These texts are extraordinary, written in prose of great power and economy, concerned with honor and reputation, with the consequences of actions across generations. They were looking back to the Viking Age from a Christian present, trying to understand ancestors who lived by different values, who inhabited a different world. The sagas are both historical sources and works of literature, both records and interpretations, shaped by the concerns of those who wrote them down as much as by the events they describe. By the mid-11th century, the Viking Age was effectively over. The Scandinavian kingdoms had become Christian monarchies, trading partners rather than raiders, participants in the broader European world rather than threats from outside. The ships still sailed, trade continued, but the culture had transformed. The old gods were fading from memory except in stories. The things were being replaced by royal courts and church councils. The independent farmer warriors giving way to subjects of kings and bishops. But what remained, what persisted, was a heritage of skill and courage, of exploration and adaptation. The Scandinavians had reached further than anyone else in their era, had established settlements from Greenland to the Caspian Sea, had integrated themselves into cultures across Europe and beyond. Their ships had been marvels of engineering, their crafts of high quality, their social systems remarkably sophisticated, and their stories, their myths and sagas, would continue to fascinate, to inspire, to provoke thought about alternative ways of organizing society, of understanding honor and duty, of relating to the natural and supernatural worlds. The longhouses slowly fell into disuse or were rebuilt along different plans. The things continued in some places but changed in character. The skulls composed new verses praising Christian kings and saints rather than Odin and Thor. The pattern-welded swords were inherited and treasured, but the techniques for making them were gradually forgotten as new methods emerged. The old ways passed, transformed, leaving traces in language and place names, in genetic heritage, in archaeological sites slowly being uncovered, telling stories of daily life and grand ambitions, of ordinary people and exceptional deeds. The runestones stand still in Sweden and Denmark and Norway, markers raised to commemorate the dead, to proclaim faith or achievement, carved with serpents and crosses, with verses in Old Norse, weathered by centuries but still legible, still connecting the present to that distant past when Vikings sailed and fought and traded and settled, when the North was less known, more mysterious, when Scandinavians were transforming from isolated communities into participants in a wider world, bringing change wherever they went, being changed in turn, and in the quiet places, in museums and archaeological sites, in the careful excavation of ship burials and settlement remains, the evidence accumulates, fragments of cloth that show patterns and dyes, combs carved from antler, gaming pieces made of walrus ivory, beads of glass and amber from trade networks spanning continents, cooking pots and loom weights, ship rivets and sword hilts, the material remains of lives lived, of choices made, of skills practiced and handed down, each object a connection to someone who held it, used it, valued it enough to keep or important enough to bury with the dead. The Viking Age lives now in scholarship and imagination, in the careful study of texts and artifacts, in the reconstruction of ships that sail again, in the reenactors who practice crafts and recreate battles, In the popular culture that sometimes understands and sometimes distorts, in the descendants of Vikings who live across the world, in Iceland and Scandinavia, certainly, but also in Britain and Ireland, in Normandy and Russia, in North America, where Vikings briefly settled 1,000 years ago, and where Scandinavian immigrants arrived in great numbers in the 19th century, the past is never truly past, never entirely gone, but lives on in altered forms, in memories and stories, in the landscapes shaped by those who came before. The deeper truth about the Vikings, about the people who lived in those longhouses and sailed those remarkable ships, is that they were not separate from us, not fundamentally different in their humanity, their hopes and fears, their loves and losses. They lived in a world with different technologies, different beliefs, different social structures, but the underlying experiences were universal. The parent watching a child learn to walk, the farmer worrying about the harvest, the trader calculating profit and risk, the warrior facing mortality, the poet seeking the perfect phrase. These are human experiences that transcend time and culture. What made Viking society distinctive was not violence, not raiding, though those happened and mattered, but rather a particular combination of values and circumstances, the emphasis on personal reputation and honor, on the importance of memory and story, on the obligation to kin and the bonds of community, on the necessity of self-reliance tempered by mutual support. These values emerged from the landscape, from the reality of life in northern lands, where cooperation was essential for survival, but where harsh conditions also demanded individual capability, where you had to be able to handle a boat in rough seas, to survive a winter when supplies ran low, to make decisions that might mean life or death for yourself and others. The relationship with the natural world was intimate in ways difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The Vikings were not romantics about nature, not preservationists in any contemporary sense, but they lived embedded in natural systems in ways we no longer do. They read weather in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky, understood the habits of fish and seals, knew which plants healed and which poisoned, when to plant and when to harvest based on subtle signs, the phases of the moon and the direction of the wind. Their survival depended on this knowledge, on attention to details we've learned to ignore, on sensitivity to changes in the environment that we no longer notice because we're insulated from direct consequences. The gods they worshipped before Christianity reflected this relationship, were not distant or abstract, but present in the world, in the thunder that could destroy crops, in the sea that could drown sailors, in the fertility of fields and livestock, in the inspiration that came to poets and the fury that seized warriors in battle. These gods had personalities, made mistakes, felt jealousy and love and anger. They were like humans but larger, more powerful, immortal but not invincible. Even they faced an ultimate fate, the Ragnarok that would end the world and the gods themselves before renewal could begin. This mythology spoke to people who knew that power was temporary, that even the mightiest could fall, that cycles of destruction and creation were fundamental to existence. The conversion to Christianity represented a profound shift not just in belief, but in worldview. The Christian God was singular, absolute, concerned with individual morality in ways the Norse gods were not. Salvation became a matter of faith and behavior, of sin and redemption rather than honor and reputation. The afterlife changed from the warrior's Valhalla, or the shadowy hell, to heaven and hell. Eternal reward or punishment based on one's relationship with God. This transformation took generations to complete, and even then, elements of the old beliefs persisted in folklore and practice, in the stories people told, in the charms they whispered, in the understanding of luck and fate that never entirely aligned with Christian doctrine, the craftsmanship that Vikings brought to everything they made, from ships to jewelry, from textiles to metalwork, speaks to a culture that valued skill and beauty, that saw no contradiction between utility and art. A cooking pot might be plain or it might be decorated. A brooch served to fasten clothing, but could also be a work of intricate beauty, hours of labor invested in creating patterns that pleased the eye, that demonstrated the maker's mastery, that connected the object to larger meanings. The interlaced patterns were not random, but followed rules, created balances and symmetries that satisfied something deep in human perception, suggested connections and continuities that words could not express. The emphasis on storytelling and poetry was not mere entertainment, but a way of preserving and transmitting culture in a society without widespread literacy, where knowledge lived in memory. The ability to compose and recite was crucial. The skalds were not just entertainers, but historians, genealogists, moral teachers. Their verses preserved the names of ancestors, the deeds of heroes, the lessons of the past. They praised and they criticized. They shaped reputation, which was perhaps the most valuable possession one could have, more lasting than silver, more important than land, because reputation lived in the memories and words of others, could elevate descendants or doom them to obscurity. Women's roles in this society were constrained by the standards of their time, certainly, but perhaps less rigidly than in some other medieval cultures. They could not usually be warriors or chieftains, though exceptions existed in story and possibly in life. But they held authority within the household, managed resources, made decisions that affected the family's prosperity. Some women became wealthy traders, others were skilled artisans, some were remembered as wise counselors, as practitioners of cedar, a form of magic associated particularly with women. The division of labor was real and significant, but it did not mean that women were without power or agency, without the ability to shape their own lives and the lives of those around them. The Viking expansion ultimately failed to create a lasting Scandinavian empire. The settlements were absorbed. The raiders became settlers and then natives of their adopted lands. But the impact persisted in less obvious ways. In the legal systems of England and Ireland that retained Norse influences, in the trade routes that connected East and West, in the genetic heritage of populations across Northern Europe, in the stories and place names that endure, in the demonstrated possibility of long-distance ocean travel that would inspire later explorers. The Vikings proved that the Atlantic could be crossed, that new lands existed far to the west, knowledge that would not be fully exploited for centuries, but that never entirely disappeared from memory. And perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age demonstrated the capacity of human beings to adapt, to learn new skills, to transform their societies in response to changing circumstances. The farmers who became raiders and traders, the pagans who became Christians, the independent warriors who became subjects of kings, The Norse speakers who adopted new languages, these transformations happened within lifetimes. People who began life in one kind of world and ended it in another, who raised children who would live completely differently than they had. This flexibility, this capacity for change while maintaining some continuity of identity, this is perhaps the most human characteristic of all. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge, each excavation revealing new details, correcting old assumptions, showing the complexity of Viking life, the diversity of experiences, the trade goods from distant lands found in remote farmsteads, the elaborate ship burials that speak to beliefs about the afterlife, the simple graves of ordinary people who lived and died without fame, the workshops where craftsmen labored, the harbors where ships gathered, the traces of houses and barns, of fields and fences, each fragment adding to understanding, each new finding prompting new questions. The past is not fixed, but constantly being reconstructed, reinterpreted, brought into conversation with the present. The longships rest now in museums, preserved by careful treatment, displayed under controlled conditions that prevent further decay. The Oseberg ship, with its graceful lines and intricate carvings, the Gokstad ship built for the open ocean. These vessels that once rode the waves now sit motionless, objects of study and wonder, but they still speak, still testify to the skill of their builders, to the courage of those who sailed in them, to the human drive to explore, to push beyond the known, to risk everything for the possibility of something more. The stones stand in fields, carved with runes that scholars translate, that tell of journeys to distant lands, of sons who died far from home, of faith and pride and loss, simple messages that connect across centuries, that make the people who carved them and the people they commemorated somehow present again, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize them, to acknowledge the connection, to honor the memory. And in the quiet places where once there were settlements, where longhouses stood and smoke rose from hearths, where children played and animals grazed, where stories were told on winter nights and ships were built in the long summer days, there is now often just grass and stone, the marks in the earth that only trained eyes can read. But the land remembers, holds within it the traces of lives lived, of communities that thrived and struggled and passed away, of the human presence that shaped the landscape and was shaped by it in turn. The wind still blows from the mountains, cold even in summer, carrying the scent of salt and pine. The waves still lap against ancient shores, the rhythm unchanging, though everything else has changed. And in that continuity, in the persistence of land and sea and sky, there is something that connects us to those distant people, that makes their world not entirely foreign, not completely lost, but present in the landscape, in the bones of the earth, in the patterns of settlement, and the routes of travel that they established, and that in some cases still persist. The story fades now, as stories must, as the light fades at the end of a long northern day, slowly, gradually, the details becoming less distinct, the specifics giving way to impressions, to the sense of something vast and complex that can never be fully known, but only approached, contemplated, honored for what it was and what it meant, for the people who lived it and the heritage they left. The Vikings are gone, absorbed into other cultures, transformed beyond recognition, but the memory remains. in the stones and the ships, in the sagas and the scholarship, in the human capacity to endure and adapt, to create and destroy, to explore and settle, to live fully in whatever world we find ourselves, and to leave behind traces, fragments, stories for those who come after